Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound in the old Hemlock Creek cabin. It was a sound Denise had grown so accustomed to over the 3 days they had been here that it had become the metronome of her thoughts, the pulse of the quiet, wooded isolation. Then, at precisely 3:33 in the afternoon, according to the ornate, sun-faded face of the clock, the ticking stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, thick and heavy, pressing against the leaded glass windows and the stout oak door. It was a held breath. Denise, who had been staring at the intricate, water-stained pattern on the ceiling, felt her own breath catch in her throat. The sudden cessation was more jarring than any noise could have been. It was an interruption in the order of things, a small, precise fracture in the skin of reality. Outside, the October wind whispered through the pines, a sound that now seemed menacingly loud. Grady had always loved Halloween. It was his favorite season, his holiday. He reveled in the theatricality of it, the sanctioned descent into darkness. Back home, their suburban colonial was the most decorated on the block, a riot of synthetic cobwebs and animatronic ghouls that groaned from the porch. He was the one who spent hours carving intricate, leering faces into a dozen pumpkins, his large, capable hands scooping out the cold, stringy guts with a kind of grim satisfaction. He loved the smell of candle smoke and scorched pumpkin flesh. He loved the way the neighborhood transformed at dusk on the 31st, the streets filling with tiny ghosts and goblins, the air turning crisp and smelling of wood smoke and decayed leaves. He said it was the one night of the year when people were honest about the monsters. This trip to the cabin, a week before Halloween, was his idea. A romantic getaway, he decalled it. A chance to disconnect before the chaos of the holiday. He de-packed the car with gourmet food, expensive wine, and a single, large duffel bag whose contents he kept secret from her. A surprise, he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The cabin, inherited from a reclusive uncle, was miles from the nearest town, nestled in a fold of the mountains where the cell signals died, and the only light at night came from the impossible sprawl of stars, or the low, orange harvest moon that haunted the tree line. The first 2 days were pleasant enough, a pantomime of a happy marriage. They hiked trails carpeted in crimson and gold leaves that crackled like bones under their boots. They drank cider on the porch, wrapped in thick blankets, watching their breath plume in the air. But Denise could feel the tension coiling beneath the surface, a familiar coldness in Grady's demeanor that the idyllic setting could not fully thaw. He was waiting for something, the countdown to his surprise. On the third morning, the morning of the stopped clock, he finally revealed it. He brought the duffel bag into the living room, where a fire spat and crackled in the stone hearth. The room was decorated with the few vintage Halloween decorations he'd found in the cabin S attic: a cardboard skeleton, a faded paper witch, a ceramic jack-o'-lantern with a crazed, lopsided grin. Their orange and black seemed garish and sinister in the rustic space. He unzipped the bag with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside were not costumes or party favors, but a set of polished steel handcuffs, a thick roll of nylon rope, a blindfold, and a small, locked metal box. "It's a game," he said, his voice low and even. "A trust exercise for Halloween, to make things exciting again." Denise felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "Grady, I don't think. It's just a game," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice he used when he had already decided, the voice that turned his suggestions into commands. "I'll cuff you to the bedpost, just for an hour. I'll be right here. I want you to feel what it's like to be completely vulnerable, to trust me completely. Then we'll switch. It's about breaking down walls, Denise." He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. The argument that followed was quiet and intense, a hissed exchange in front of the fire. Her fear, her refusal, were met with calm, logical persuasion that slowly curdled into something harder, colder. He accused her of being distant, of not trying, of not trusting him. He said she was afraid of real intimacy, of real feeling. He framed her reluctance as a character flaw, a failure in their marriage. "It's just a game," he said for the third time. And in that moment, it was no longer a request. It was a test. And she, exhausted, wanting to believe in the man she had married, wanting to bridge the chasm that had grown between them, reluctantly, fearfully, agreed. The cold of the steel bracelet around her right wrist was a shock. It clicked shut with a sound of terrible finality. He de-chained her to the thick, carved post of the heavy oak bed in the master bedroom. He deep and gentle, almost clinical. He kissed her forehead. "1 hour," he whispered. "I'll be right outside. Think about what it means to let go." He closed the bedroom door. She heard his footsteps recede down the hall. Then, the ticking of the clock. For 10 minutes, she listened to it, counting the seconds, feeling the absurdity and the slight thrill of the situation. It was a game, a stupid, adult game. She focused on the room, a patchwork quilt on the bed, a faded rug on the wide plank floor, a mirror on the wall that reflected the gray light from the window, a single fat orange pumpkin, still uncarved, sat on the dresser, a gift from Grady. Then she heard the front door open and close. Her heart gave a single, hard thump. A joke, she thought. He just getting more wood for the fire. She heard the engine of their SUV turn over, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent woods. The crunch of tires on gravel. The sound receded, growing fainter and fainter, until it was swallowed completely by the wind and the silence. That was 5 hours ago. The first hour was pure, undiluted panic. A frantic, animalistic pulling against the cuff, the metal biting into her wrist until the skin was raw and smeared with blood. She screamed until her throat was ragged, her voice echoing in the empty cabin, a futile noise absorbed by the logs and the insulation. No one was around for miles. The knowledge was an ice water bath. The cabin was a tomb. The second hour was a desperate inventory. She scanned the room for anything: a nail file, a piece of wire, a loose screw. The bed was solid, immovable oak. The post was thick, its carvings offering no purchase. The cuff was police grade, tight and unyielding. Her struggles had only exhausted her and painted a dark bracelet of bruise and blood around her wrist. The third hour brought the hallucinations. Or perhaps they were memories. They came unbidden, rising from the cold, dark water of her mind. Grady, his face a mask of calm reason after he backed her into a corner during an argument, his voice a soft, relentless hammer. Grady, forgetting to tell her about a party he knew she'd dread. Grady, isolating her from her friends with 1,000 small criticisms, each one delivered with a sigh of concern. They ray not good for you, Denise. They don't understand us. This was not a new game. It was the final, logical extension of all the games that had come before. As the afternoon light began to fail, leaching the color from the room, the pumpkin on the dresser seemed to change. The smooth, waxy skin of it began to look less like a vegetable and more like flesh. The vibrant orange deepened to a morbid, bruised sienna. She imagined she could see a pulse in its stem. The clock had stopped at 3:33. Now, in the deepening twilight, other sounds began to assert themselves. The wind was no longer a whisper, but a low moan in the chimney. The branches of a skeletal lilac bush scraped against the window pane like long, dry fingernails. And beneath it all, a new sound, a soft, wet, tearing noise. It came from the living room. Her breath hitched. She strained her ears, every muscle in her body rigid. The sound stopped. Silence. Then it came again, a ripping, a squelching, followed by a slow, deliberate scraping. "Grady," she called out, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "Is that you? This isn't funny anymore." The only answer was the scraping. It was the sound of a shovel being dragged across dirt, or something heavy being pulled across the rough-hewn floorboards. The last of the daylight died, and the room was plunged into a deep, velvety blue. The moon had not yet risen. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight on her eyes. The sounds from the living room continued, more purposeful now. A thud, a rustle like dry corn husks, a low, guttural humming that was not a tune, but a vibration. Then a flicker of orange, light under the door. It was the warm, dancing light of a candle. He was back. He had come back. A sob of relief caught in her throat, followed immediately by a surge of white-hot anger. She would kill him. She would scream at him. She would. The door handle turned. It was not the brisk, confident turn of Grady's hand. It was slow, hesitant, the old brass knob creaking as it rotated. The door swung inward. The figure standing there was not Grady. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its form seeming to waver at the edges like a heat haze. It was silhouetted against the flickering orange glow from the living room, a glow that she now saw came from the fireplace and from the jack-o'-lanterns. All the jack-o'-lanterns. The cardboard skeleton, the paper witch, the ceramic pumpkin, all had candles burning inside them, their carved faces contorted into new, unfamiliar expressions of agony. The thing in the doorway held something in its hands. It was the large pumpkin from the living room, now carved. But the face was not the work of any knife. It was a ragged, weeping hole of a mouth, with jagged, broken teeth, and two slanted eyes that dripped with viscous, seed-speckled pulp. The candle inside guttered, making the shadows of the features writhe. The thing took a step into the room. It was not holding the pumpkin was its head. Its body was a confusion of shadows and tattered, dark clothing that smelled of damp earth and rotting vegetation. It made that low, humming sound again, a noise that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of her bones. Denise shrank back against the bed, pressing herself into the wooden post, trying to make herself small, invisible. The thing ignored her. It walked with a slow, shuffling gait to the dresser and picked up the fat orange pumpkin she had been staring at all afternoon. Its long, pale fingers, caked with dirt, stroked the surface of the pumpkin with a terrible tenderness. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it plunged its thumb into the top of the pumpkin. There was a wet, cracking pop. It began to scoop out the innards, the stringy, cold guts falling to the floor with soft, wet plops. The smell that filled the room was not just that of pumpkin, but of something older, of turned soil and open graves. It worked with a dreadful efficiency, carving a face into the gourd without any visible tool. The face it carved was her own, a distorted, screaming version of her own face, the mouth a wide O of terror, the eyes wide and blank. When it was finished, it placed the pumpkin on the dresser, the candle inside suddenly igniting to cast her own screaming likeness in frantic, dancing shadows across the wall. The thing with the pumpkin head turned its dripping gaze toward her. It took a step closer. The humming grew louder, resolving into a word, or the semblance of a word, breathed out on a gust of foul, cold air. Trick, it reached for her, not with the handcuff key she desperately prayed for, but with those long, dirt-caked fingers. They moved toward her face, not to strike, but to touch, to caress. She screamed, a raw, endless sound that tore from the deepest part of her. She thrashed against the cuff, the metal grinding against bone. The thing leaned in, its pumpkin head filling her vision, the candlelight flickering in the deep, wet hollows of its eyes. The smell of decay was overwhelming. Then headlights. Two bright, white spears of light cut through the bedroom window, painting bars across the ceiling. The sound of a car engine, the crunch of gravel. Voices, human voices, called out. Hello, police, anyone home? The thing with the pumpkin head straightened up. Its humming stopped. It tilted its head, as if listening. Then it simply dissolved. It didn't run or vanish. It collapsed in on itself, falling into a pile of dark cloth, wet leaves, and pumpkin guts on the floor. The candle in the jack-o'-lantern head went out. The candle in the pumpkin with her face went out. The room was plunged into blackness, save for the sweeping glare of the headlights from outside. The front door splintered open with a crash. Heavy footsteps pounded through the living room. A beam of powerful flashlight cut through the darkness of the bedroom, blinding her. "Ma'am, we've got you. You're safe now." Strong hands, real, warm human hands, were on her shoulders. A uniformed officer, his face a mask of professional concern, was looking down at her. Another was radioing for an ambulance. They found the key to the handcuffs on the floor near the bed, as if it had been dropped there. They freed her wrist, and the sudden release from the metal bite was so profound she almost fainted. They wrapped her in a blanket and led her, shivering, into the living room. The police lights outside painted the walls in pulsating red and blue. The Halloween decorations were just that, decorations. The cardboard skeleton hung limply. The paper witch was still. The ceramic jack-o'-lantern sat cold and dark on the mantel. There was no sign of the thing, only a faint, lingering smell of rot, which the officers attributed to the pile of fresh pumpkin innards smeared across the bedroom floor. They asked her questions. Where was her husband? She didn't know. What happened? She tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled, hysterical torrent. A game, handcuffs, he left, the thing, the pumpkin head. The officers exchanged glances. They had found her SUV abandoned at a trailhead 3 miles away. The keys were in the ignition. There was no sign of Grady. Days passed. The search parties combed the woods. The story made the local news. A tawdry tale of a marital spat gone wrong. A possible abduction. A woman driven to the brink. Denise gave her statement again and again, each time sanding down the rough, impossible edges of her story, until it was a smooth, palatable narrative of being left handcuffed by her unstable husband. The part about the thing with the pumpkin head stayed, locked inside her, a rotting secret. Halloween night arrived. The world outside her sister's safe, suburban home was a riot of cheerful, macabre celebration. Children in costumes darted through the streets, their laughter sharp and bright on the cold air. Porches glowed with the friendly light of jack-o'-lanterns. The doorbell rang incessantly, a chorus of demands for candy. Denise sat in the darkened living room, the lights off, refusing to answer the door. She watched the costumed figures through the window. A tiny astronaut, a princess, a dinosaur. Then, a group of older children. They wore dark, tattered robes, and their faces were hidden not by store-bought masks, but by expertly carved pumpkins. The pumpkins were grotesque, masterpieces of vegetable horror, with twisted grins and asymmetrical eyes. As they passed under the street lamp, one of them turned its head. The candle inside guttered, and for a moment, in the flickering orange light, the carved face seemed to shift, to sag, to form the weeping, ragged hole of a mouth she remembered from the cabin. Her breath froze in her lungs. The pumpkin-headed child stopped, its body unnaturally still amidst the running, laughing crowd. It slowly raised a hand, not in a wave, but with a single, pale finger pointing directly at her window. Then from the kitchen, where a bowl of candy sat unattended on the table, she heard a soft, wet, tearing noise. It was the sound of a thumb being plunged into a pumpkin-esque skull. It was the sound of something being scooped out. It was followed by the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair leg across the tile floor. Denise did not turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty street, where the pumpkin-headed child was now gone. The doorbell rang, a shrill, impatient chime that echoed in the silent house. The scraping sound in the kitchen stopped. The tearing sound stopped. The house was perfectly quiet, waiting for her to answer the door, to participate in the ritual, to offer a gift to the darkness outside. She sat perfectly still, a statue in the dark, listening to the silence that was no longer silent, understanding that some doors, once opened on a Halloween night, can never truly be closed. The veil had thinned for her, and on the other side, something had noticed. It had tasted her fear, a unique and potent vintage, and it had found her again. It was not bound to the cabin in the woods. It was bound to her. The doorbell rang again, this time longer, a sustained, angry buzz. From the kitchen, a new sound emerged. A low, guttural hum, the same vibration that had filled the cabin bedroom. It was not loud, but it seemed to push against the air in the house, making the window pane in front of her tremble. She could not stay in the chair. To remain still was to be a target. She had to move to see, to know. Slowly, her joints protesting with a cold stiffness, she rose from the chair. The blanket her sister had given her slipped to the floor. She took a step, then another, her socks silent on the plush carpet. The hum grew no louder, but it felt closer, as if its source had shifted from the kitchen to the hallway just behind her. The archway between the living room and the kitchen was a black maw. The cheerful yellow light she had left on over the stove was off. The only illumination came from the streetlights filtering through the window, casting long, distorted shadows from the table and chairs. The bowl of candy sat in the center of the table, a bright orange plastic cauldron. It was full. It had been nearly empty an hour ago. Now it brimmed with a tangle of thick white and orange vines. Not fake, decorative vines, but real pumpkin vines, fresh from the earth, glistening with a dewy moisture that looked black in the dim light. They spilled over the sides of the bowl and coiled across the tabletop. And nestled among the vines, like eggs in a nest, were several small, perfectly formed pumpkins. Each one was carved. Each one bore a tiny, meticulously rendered face. She saw Grady's face, his mouth open in a silent scream. She saw her own again, this one with eyes wide in terror. She saw the faces of the police officers who had found her. The humming stopped. The back door, which led to the small, fenced-in yard, was open. It had been locked. She had checked it 3 times since sunset. Through the doorway, the night was a deep, solid black, devoid of the ambient light from the neighboring houses. It was the absolute black of a deep woods, of a moonless night, of a closed eye. A figure detached itself from that darkness and stepped into the kitchen. It was the same tall, thin form, a construct of shadows and tattered cloth. This time, its head was not a pumpkin, but a hollowed-out gourd, pale and elongated like a ghost gourd, with 2 dark, empty sockets for eyes. It stood just inside the door, waiting. The doorbell rang a 3rd time, insistent, desperate. Then the knocking started. Not a polite rap, but a heavy, meaty thudding, as if someone were pounding on the wood with a closed fist. The front door shook in its frame. The thing in the kitchen took a step toward her. It raised one of its long, pale hands. In its fingers, it held not a knife, but a single, long, curved pumpkin vine, thorned and sharp. It was an offering, an invitation. She understood then. This was not a haunting. It was a recruitment. The thing, the spirit, the entity of the harvest decay, had chosen her. Grady had been the catalyst, his cruelty a key that turned a lock in the fabric of the world, but she was the prize. Her terror, her vulnerability, her raw survival had made her interesting, special. The pounding on the front door intensified, becoming a violent, splintering rhythm. The thing in the kitchen took another step. The thorned vine held out like a scepter. From the blackness of the backyard, she could now see other shapes moving, shuffling, their heads misshapen lumps of squash and gourd, their bodies rustling with dry leaves. They were waiting for her to join them, to become one of them, to walk through the open door and into the endless, dark Halloween night. The choice was hers. Answer the frantic, breaking door, or accept the gift from the silent, waiting thing. Both doors were open. Both led into different kinds of darkness. A cold certainty settled over her. The game was not over. It had only just begun, and it was a game she would be playing for the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. She took a step, not towards the frantic noise, but towards the silent, patient thing in the kitchen, and the endless night behind it. Her hand trembled as she reached out. The air around the thing was frigid, a pocket of deep autumn chill that made her fingers ache. She did not want to touch the thorned vine, but some deep, instinctual part of her knew that to refuse was a far worse fate. Her fingertips brushed against the cold, rough stem. The moment she made contact, a jolt, like static electricity, but colder and deeper, shot up her arm. The world did not dissolve or spin, but it shifted. The cheerful, distant sounds of children laughing on the street became faint, mocking shrieks. The smell of the kitchen changed from the faint aroma of her sister's meatloaf to the rich, overpowering scent of loam and decaying vegetation. The thing with the ghost gourd head nodded slowly, a gesture of ancient and terrible welcome. It turned and shuffled back toward the open door to the yard. Denise followed, her steps no longer her own, yet completely voluntary. She was a prisoner walking of her own free will. As As she crossed the threshold, the splintering cacophony at the front door ceased abruptly, replaced by an absolute, suffocating silence. The backyard was gone. In its place was a field under a starless, purple-black sky. A low, guttering orange glow on the horizon suggested an unseen moon. The ground was soft and tilled beneath her socks, and all around her stood a crooked, sprawling pumpkin patch. The pumpkins were not round and cheerful. They were twisted, lumpy, and pale, their shapes suggestive of human heads bowed in sorrow or pain. Some were carved, their faces not of jesting ghouls, but of tormented souls, their eyes weeping black seeds. The thing that had led her here moved silently through the rows, and other figures emerged from the shadows between the vines. They were like the first, tall and thin, their heads hollowed out gourds of every variety warty knuckleheads, long-necked crooknecks, pale lumina. They did not speak. They communicated in a language of rustling leaves and soft, wet, tearing sounds that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. One of them, its head a small, smashed pumpkin from which a single, unblinking eye seemed to stare, reached out and took her hand. Its touch was like dry bark. It led her to a clear space where the earth was dark and rich. The others formed a silent, shuffling circle around her. The first thing, the one from the cabin and the kitchen, stood before her. It raised its hands, and from the vines at its feet, a new pumpkin began to grow. It swelled from a bud to a mature fruit in seconds, its skin the color of old ivory. It was smooth and unblemished, the thing's long finger extended, its nail like a shard of dried clay. It began to carve, not into the pumpkin, but into the air above it. As its finger moved, lines of decay appeared on the pumpkin's surface, etching a face. Her face. But this was not a face of terror. It was a face of serene, empty calm. The eyes were closed. The mouth was a gentle, straight line. She understood. This was to be her new face. Her old one, the one that could scream and cry and plead, was no longer necessary. It was a flaw to be corrected. As the final line was carved, a deep, resonant hum rose from the circle of figures, a sound that seemed to pull at the very substance of her being. She felt a strange loosening, a gentle pressure around her head, as if she were submerged in deep water. She did not fight it. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was distant, a memory of an emotion she could no longer fully access. She looked past the circle, back toward the direction of the house. For a moment, the field wavered, and she could see the neat, square outline of her sister's backyard, the warm, yellow light of the kitchen window. A figure her sister was standing there, peering out into the darkness, a hand raised to the glass. She was so close, just a few dozen steps away. Then the vision faded, and the endless pumpkin field was all that remained. The thing with the ghost-gored head lifted the newly carved pumpkin. It did not place it upon her head. It simply offered it, holding it out in its pale, dirt-caked hands. The humming of the circle reached a fever pitch, a vibration that promised both an end and a beginning. Denise, or what was left of her, reached out and took it. The ivory pumpkin was cool and surprisingly heavy in her hands. It felt less like a vegetable and more like polished stone or ancient, petrified bone. The circle of gourd-headed things watched, their hollow eye sockets fixed on her, their silence more demanding than any shouted command. She knew what to do. It was an understanding that had been planted deep inside her the moment her fingers had touched the thorned vine. She raised the pumpkin high, her arms trembling not with fear, but with a strange, ceremonial gravity. The humming of the circle softened to a low, expectant thrum, the sound of a heartbeat deep within the earth. She brought the pumpkin down onto her own head. There was no impact, no crushing of bone or flesh. Instead, there was a sensation of settling, of roots seeking soil. The world outside the eye holes did not go dark. It changed. The purplish-black sky gained a new dimension, streaked with veins of phosphorescent orange. The twisted pumpkin patch now glowed with a faint, internal light, each gourd a tiny lantern revealing the sorrow etched upon its face. She could see the life in the vines, the slow, patient pulse of sap, the deep, dreaming thoughts of the seeds buried in the dark earth. The thing with the ghost gourd head stepped forward and placed its hands on either side of her new face. Its touch was final, a benediction. A name, or the concept of a name, bloomed in her mind, not as a sound, but as a flavor on the cold air. The last harvest. She was part of it now. A reaper of the season's end. The circle broke, its members turning and shuffling back into the patch, melting between the rows of vines. Her guide remained. It pointed a long finger away from the field, toward a line of dark, skeletal trees. A path, barely visible, wound its way into the woods. Without words, it communicated its meaning. Their work was not here. The field was a sanctuary, a chapel. The world outside was their parish. She followed it, her steps making no sound on the soft, tilled earth. As they entered the woods, the sounds of the ordinary world began to filter back, but they were distorted, thin, and far away. A dog barking became a series of sharp, cracking twigs. The distant siren of a police car was a wailing wind. They walked until the trees thinned, and they stood at the edge of a suburban street, looking at a house with a brightly decorated porch. A teenage boy, dressed as a zombie, was stomping up the walkway, his mask askew, his bag of candy held tightly. He was laughing, shoving his friend playfully. The innocence of the scene was a stark, almost painful contrast to the silent darkness where she stood. Her guide made a soft, clicking sound. It was an instruction. Denise, the thing that was Denise, focused on the boy. She did not move, did not speak. She simply reached, not with her hands, but with the new sense that had awakened within her carved skull. She reached for the tiny, hidden fear in his heart, the fear of being truly alone, the fear that his friends were just humoring him, the fear that under the mask, he was nothing. The boy's laughter died in his throat. He stopped on the porch steps, his friend bumping into him. "Hey, you okay?" the friend asked. The boy didn't he answer. He was staring into the darkness between the two houses, right at the spot where they stood. He couldn't he see them, not clearly, but he felt the weight of their gaze, the profound emptiness they projected. His bravado melted away, leaving a raw, childish terror. He dropped his candy bag, the plastic cracking open, spilling brightly wrapped sweets onto the concrete. "Let us just go," he whispered, his voice trembling. He and his friend fled, leaving the spoils of their trick-or-treating behind. A sense of quiet satisfaction, cold and deep, flowed through her. It was not malice. It was purpose. They had not harmed the boy. They had simply harvested what was already there, a small, ripe fear, leaving it to rot on the vine of his memory. Her guide turned its ghost-gored head toward her. In the deep silence of their communion, she felt its approval. This was the trick. This was the treat. They were the thinners of the veil, the reminders of the decay that followed every season of growth, the chill that waited after the last warmth of the sun. Together, they turned from the bright, noisy street and retreated back into the deeper darkness of the woods, leaving the ordinary world to its fleeting celebrations. Somewhere, a child was crying. Somewhere, a porch light was flickering out. And in the endless, rotating patch, a new pumpkin, small and perfectly formed, began to swell from the earth, its skin slowly hardening, waiting for a face to be carved. The crying child was a girl, no more than 6, dressed in a glittery princess costume. She stood alone under a flickering street lamp, her plastic tiara askew, clutching an empty plastic pumpkin bucket. She had been separated from her parents, and the familiar street had become a canyon of looming shadows and distorted sounds. Her fear was a bright, sharp thing, a green apple not yet ready to fall. Denise felt its tartness on the air. Her guide paused, its head tilted, assessing the quality of the emotion. This was not the deep, complex fear of the teenage boy. This was pure, primal terror, a delicacy. The little girl's sobs hitched as she sensed a new presence. She looked toward the tree line, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. She could not see the two figures clearly, only impressions of height and stillness, and a pale, round shape that might have been a face. Denise took a step forward, the vines at her feet parting silently for her. The girl took a stumbling step back, a small whimper escaping her lips. The fear intensified, sweetening the air. Denise reached out with that same internal sense, not to amplify the fear, but to taste it, to draw its essence into herself. It was a clean, cold energy that filled the hollow spaces of her gored skull. But as she drew it in, something else came with it. A flicker of memory, not her own. The warm weight of a hand holding hers. The smell of a mother's perfume. The safe, yellow glow of a living room. These were the anchors of the girl's world, the things she was terrified of losing. For a single, shattering moment, the serene emptiness inside Denise fractured. A ghost of her old self stirred, a pang of something that was not cold satisfaction, but but a hot, sharp pity. The carved face of serene calm on her pumpkin head felt like a lie, a prison. Her guide made a low, warning rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. It sensed her hesitation, the corruption of her purpose. The little girl, spurred by some deep instinct, turned and ran, her small, shiny shoes slapping against the pavement, her cries growing fainter as she disappeared around a corner, toward the sound of an adult's frantic call. The connection broke. The warmth of the memory vanished, leaving Denise colder than before. The field of twisted pumpkins and the starless sky felt more real, more absolute. She had failed the test. Her guide turned to her fully. It did not raise its hands in anger. It simply stood, its hollow gaze a void that demanded an answer. From the folds of its tattered cloth, it produced a single black seed, hard and polished like a piece of obsidian. It held the seed out to her. The meaning was clear. This was her penance, her next task. A seed of fear planted would grow into a harvest of its own. It was not enough to reap what was already grown. A true servant of the last harvest must also sow. It pointed a long, pale finger back toward the houses, toward a specific one with a well-kept lawn and a cheerful, illuminated ghost decoration swaying in the breeze. Her sister's house. The warm, yellow light was still on in the kitchen window. The seed felt like ice in her palm. To plant it there, in that soil of love and normalcy, would be to corrupt it forever. It would be the final, irrevocable step away from the woman she had been. The ghost of pity inside her wailed, a silent protest. But the cold certainty of the field, the humming of the circle, the weight of the pumpkin on her shoulders, it was all a heavier truth. The woman was gone. Only the harvester remained. She closed her carved fingers around the seed. She nodded to her guide. Together, they began to walk toward the light, not to extinguish it, but to watch it slowly, patiently, curdle from within. The night was still young, and the harvest was endless. The walk back to her sister's house was a journey through a world now layered with two realities. The neat sidewalks and manicured lawns were a thin film over the true landscape of creeping vines and soft, tilled earth, the cheerful Halloween decorations, the rubber bats. The synthetic cobwebs seemed like pathetic, childish attempts to mimic the profound decay she now served. They did not approach from the front. They drifted through the side yard, their passage silent, the shadows clinging to them like loyal hounds. The kitchen window was a glowing rectangle of false warmth. Her sister, Carol, was inside, talking on the phone, her face pinched with worry. She was gesturing with one hand, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten on a plate beside her. She was talking about Denise, about how she hadn't answered the door, about how her car was still here. Denise watched from the darkness, the black seed, a cold, hard knot in her fist. Her guide stood beside her, a statue of patient shadow. It was waiting for her to complete the task. Carol hung up the phone and rubbed her temples. she walked to the back door, the same door Denise had exited through a lifetime ago, and peered out into the yard. Her eyes scanned the familiar shapes of the swing set, the grill, the tidy flower beds. For a moment, her gaze seemed to pass directly over them, and Denise felt a tremor, a faint echo of the connection she had felt with the little girl. Carol S. Fear was a different vintage, a slow, simmering dread about a missing sister, a life disrupted, a mystery with no answer. It was the perfect soil. Her guide gave a soft, rustling nudge. Denise stepped forward to the very edge where the manicured lawn met the raw, dark earth of her new world. She knelt, the damp grass not touching her, the cold soil welcoming her. With one finger, she parted the grass at the base of a rose bush Carol cherished, its last blooms browning at the edges. She dug a small, shallow hole with her thumb. The earth was cool and soft. She held the seed over the hole. The ghost of her old self was silent now, smothered by the immense, quiet weight of the pumpkin on her shoulders. This was not an act of malice. It was an act of nature. The rose bush would wither, yes. The fear in the house would grow, festering in the dark, fed by this tiny piece of absolute night. But from that decay, something new would eventually emerge. Something belonging to the last harvest. She dropped the seed into the hole and covered it with a handful of dark, rich soil. As she patted the earth flat, she felt a subtle vibration travel up her arm, a connection snapping into place. The deed was done. When she stood, Carol was still at the window, but she was no longer looking out. She had her arms wrapped around herself, a solitary figure in the bright, lonely kitchen. She shivered, though the room was warm, and clicked the lock on the door. Denise turned away. There was no satisfaction, no regret. There was only the work. Her guide was already receding into the shadows, its form blurring with the night. Other gourd-headed figures were emerging from the spaces between the houses, their silent congregation growing. They had felt the planting. They acknowledged her now not as a novice, but as a true participant. One of them, shorter than the rest with a head like a lumpy, dark green squash, gestured with a twig-like finger down the street. A new source of fear was blooming there, ripe and pungent. An argument between neighbors was escalating, shouts laced with years of resentment. It was a richer, more complex harvest than a child's terror. Denise followed the group, her steps in time with their silent, shuffling rhythm. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the trees, a sound that was also their language. She understood it now. It spoke of the turning of the world, of the inevitable fall after summer, of the long, cold sleep that gives meaning to the spring. They were not monsters. They were a season, and as they moved down the street, the porch lights on the houses seemed to grow dimmer, one by one, as if bowing to the approaching dark. The argument was a thick, ugly vine tangled around a small blue house. A man and a woman stood on the porch, their faces contorted in the yellow glow of a bug light. The words were sharp, about money and time and broken promises, but But Denise and her kind heard the deeper truth. It was the sound of a love rotting from the inside, the sweet, sickly scent of trust turning to compost. The harvesters did not approach the couple directly. They simply gathered at the property line, a silent semicircle of pale, carved faces turned toward the house. They became a mirror, reflecting back the ugliness, amplifying the decay that was already present. Denise felt the energy of the conflict like a physical pressure. She focused on the woman, whose fear was not of the man, but of the emptiness that would follow his leaving. It was a cold, vast fear, the fear of a field after the final crop has been taken. Denise drank it in, and as she did, the woman's shouting faltered. A different kind of tears, quiet and hopeless, began to fall. The man, confused by the sudden shift, stared at her, his own anger deflating into a bewildered exhaustion. The harvest was complete. The vibrant, hot anger had been transformed into a cold, lasting despair. It was a better, more enduring yield. The figures turned as one and melted back into the shadows between the houses, their work efficient and total. Denise moved with them, no longer needing guidance. She was learning the landscapes of fear, how to find the weak spots in the world of light and warmth. They moved through the sleeping town for what felt like hours, or perhaps moments. Time was different in their company. They harvested the lingering dread from a man who had watched a scary movie alone, the subtle anxiety of a new mother listening too closely to her baby's breathing, the secret shame of a teenager who felt unseen in his own family. Each was a small, perfect fruit, gathered and stored in the silent, collective memory of the patch. Eventually, they found themselves at the edge of a playground, the swings moving gently in the wind as if pushed by invisible hands. The harvest here was thin, the children's fears having been tucked into bed or chased away by nightlights. It was a place of potential, not fulfillment. Her original guide, the one with the ghost-gourd head, separated from the group and stood before her. It placed its hands on her pumpkin head once more, and a new understanding flowed into her. The night was waning. The veil between worlds, stretched thin by the holiday, was beginning to thicken again. Their work in this place was nearly done. It was time to return. They did not walk back the way they had come. The world seemed to fold around them, the suburban streets blurring and running like wet paint, until the colors resolved back into the deep purples and blacks of the endless pumpkin field. The air was still and cold, humming with the low, resonant frequency of the place. The others were already there, standing motionless among the vines, their work complete. The field itself seemed richer, darker, the faces on the pumpkins more deeply carved, their expressions of sorrow and empty, calm more profound. Her guide led her to the spot where she had been transformed. The earth was still disturbed from her planting. It pointed to the ground. Denise understood. She was not to leave. This was her place now. She was both the harvester and the harvest. She knelt, the cool soil welcoming her, She felt a deep pull, a rooting. Vines crept from the earth, not thorny and wild, but gentle and sure, twining around her legs, her arms, holding her in a soft, final embrace. She felt herself settling, her consciousness spreading out through the network of roots that connected every plant in the field. She could feel the others, their silent, patient thoughts, their memories of 1,000 past harvests. She could feel the new seeds they had planted in the world. Tiny black points of future, decay, waiting for their season to grow. The weight on her shoulders was no longer a burden. The carved pumpkin was not a mask. It was her true face, finally at peace. She was part of the field. She was part of the silence. She was a story told to frighten children, a chill in the autumn air, a face in the moonlit patch, waiting for the veil to grow thin once more. High above, the strange, starless sky began to lighten to a deep, bruised gray. Dawn was coming. In the world she had left, her sister would wake to a mystery that would never be solved, and a rose bush that would never bloom again. Here, in the endless field, a new pumpkin, smooth and ivory white, swelled gently from the vine directly before her. It was perfect. It was waiting. And as the first true light of a world, she no longer belonged to touch the far edge of the field. She began the long, slow work of carving its face. The first cut was not made with a knife. It was an act of will, a focusing of intent that caused a fine, hairline crack to appear in the smooth, white skin of the new pumpkin. A sliver of the pale shell fell away, revealing the darkness within. This was how it was done. The face was not imposed, but revealed, drawn out from the potential sleeping inside the gourd. Her consciousness, now vast and rooted, flowed into the task. She felt the resistance of the rind, the soft, stringy pulp within. She was not carving a face of her own choosing, but the face of a fear yet to be born. She saw glimpses of it in the swirling darkness, the terror of a forgotten promise, the chill of a familiar room suddenly feeling alien, the slow dawning realization that you are not the person you thought you were. As she worked, a memory that was not hers surfaced from the collective mind of the field. It was the face of the teenage boy from the porch, his momentary fear now a permanent part of the tapestry. His brief collapse of confidence became the model for the downward curve of the new pumpkin-s mouth, a small, tragic frown. The little girl S lost, glittery princess, became the basis for the wide, empty circles of the eyes, perpetually searching for a light that was not there, and from her sister, S quiet, domestic dread. She carved the subtle, worried lines across the brow. The face took shape under her silent, patient guidance. It was a composite of every harvest from the night, a map of sorrows collected and stored. It was beautiful in its utter desolation. When the last fragment of shell fell away, the new pumpkin sat complete before her. Its hollow gaze was fixed on the perpetually twilight sky of the field. It was ready. It would wait here, fed by the decay of 1,000 other worlds, until the next thinning of the veil. Then it would be chosen. It would be worn, and the cycle would begin again. A deep, resonant hum passed through the field, a vibration of approval traveled through the roots and into her core. The work was good. The balance was maintained. She settled into her own stillness, the vines holding her fast. Her individual thoughts began to dissolve, merging back into the slow, patient dream of the patch. She was no longer Denise. She was the memory of a woman, the instrument of a season, a keeper of the quiet that follows the noise. The last thing she felt was a single dry leaf blown by a wind that did not stir the air, coming to rest against her cheek. Then there was only the waiting and the slow, sure turning of the world toward fall. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the low thrum of the field, a sound like dormant bees in a frozen hive. It was the sound of potential, of fears yet to be imagined and harvested. From this shared consciousness, a new understanding began to form, not in words, but in a slow, dawning awareness that spread from one rooted harvester to the next. The world they had left was changing. The season of masks and thin veils was passing, giving way to a time of longer nights and a different, more profound kind of dread. The harvest would continue, but the methods would need to adapt. The blatant terrors of Halloween were simple sustenance. The quiet despair of the coming months would be a more complex vintage, a directive, ancient and cold as the soil itself, filtered through the network of roots. They were to become more subtle. They were to learn the texture of loneliness in a crowded room, the taste of financial anxiety in a well-kept home, the sound of hope slowly dying of neglect. The field began to prepare. The pumpkins, with their sorrowful and serene faces, started to shift. Their orange and white hues deepened, taking on the muted tones of November dull bronze, ashen gray, the deep green of rotting moss. Some shriveled slightly, their features becoming more gaunt and skeletal, better suited to the stark landscape of bare branches and early frost. A pull, gentle but insistent, tugged at her roots. It was not a summons to leave, but a call to extend. Her consciousness, still anchored deep within the patch, began to stretch out, a single, seeking tendril of thought slipping through the thinning barrier between worlds. She did not target a person this time, but a place. A quiet office on a high floor, where a man sat long after everyone else had gone home, the blue light of his computer screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He was worrying about the future, about numbers on a spreadsheet that refused to align. The fear was a low, constant pressure in his temples, a knot of tension in his shoulders. It was not the pure, sweet terror of the little girl, nor the hot anger of the arguing couple. It was a dry, bitter thing. She did not amplify it. She did not need to. She simply held her presence there, a silent witness in the corner of the room, a faint chill that made him pull his jacket tighter. She let him feel the depth of the silence around him, the vast, uncaring darkness beyond the window. She let the emptiness of the office become a mirror for the emptiness he feared was coming. His anxiety, once a scattered cloud of worries, began to coalesce into a cold, hard certainty. This was his life. This silent, fluorescent lit room was the reality. The future was not a thing to be built, but a slow, inevitable decline. The harvest was small, but it was clean. A single, withered fruit of despair. She withdrew her awareness, the essence of his fear flowing back along the psychic tendril to nourish the field. The other rooted ones were doing the same, in 1,000 different rooms, in 1,000 different towns. Their collective presence, a fine, cold mist of dread settling over the waking world. This was their new work. Not a single night of revelry, but a long, patient season of decay. And as she settled back into the deep, humming silence of the patch, she knew, with a certainty that was beyond thought, that this harvest would be the most abundant of all. Story 2. The thought arrived not as my own, but as a cold, smooth stone placed on the tongue of my mind. The house is hungry again. I was halfway across the country, staring at the blank, indifferent face of a hotel room wall when it surfaced. It was a child-s thought, phrased in a child-s simple, terrifying logic, and it tasted of wax and rotting pumpkin. It was October 22nd. The flight attendant's voice, a tinny recording from the past, echoed in my memory, telling me to return my seat to its upright position. I was already upright. I had been for years. But now, hurtling back to Hemlock Creek, I felt the old slouch of dread settling into my spine. The town wore its Halloween costume well. From the cab window, it was a postcard of autumnal decay. Crimson and burnt orange leaves choked the gutters and carpeted the lawns. On every porch, jack-o'-lanterns watched with flickering, candle-lit grins, their carved eyes following the car as we passed. In the fading afternoon light, the plastic skeletons strung up in trees took on a disturbing articulation, their limbs seeming to twitch in the wind that carried the sweet, spicy scent of cinnamon from kitchen windows and the acrid smoke of burning leaves. It was a Tuesday, but the air was thick with the promise of the coming night, the 31st, a promise that felt less like celebration and more like a threat. The house on Hemlock Drive was exactly as I remembered, which was the problem. It was a tall, Victorian brute of a structure, its clapboard skin the color of a day-old bruise. It seemed to absorb the weak October light rather than reflect it. 2 massive oak trees flanked it like sentinels, their bare branches clawing at the gray, woolen sky. My parents had loved this house, had filled it with the detritus of their lives, and eventually, the silence of their deaths. A car accident on a rain-slicked road in March. A quick, clean end for them. A long, messy one for Jackie and me. My sister was already there, a silhouette against the bright rectangle of the open front door. She stood with her arms crossed, a posture I knew well. It was her "I'm handling this" stance, which usually meant she was moments from coming apart at the seams. "Garrett," she said, her voice flat. The wind snatched at a stray strand of her dark hair, whipping it across her face. "You made it." "Traffic was hell," I said, heaving my duffel bag onto my shoulder. The joke, such as it was, died in the cold air between us. We stood there for a moment, two strangers bound by blood and bad memories, the house looming behind her like a third, more dominant sibling. The air on the porch was different, colder. It carried the damp, fungal smell of wet earth and something else, something sweetly rotten, like a pumpkin left to spoil in the basement. The interior was a museum of our childhood, preserved under a fine layer of dust and grief. The same floral wallpaper, now faded into a vague memory of a pattern. The same heavy furniture, its dark wood groaning under the weight of years. My Mother S collection of ceramic owls stared down from a high shelf, their glass eyes glittering in the gloom. It was all so familiar, yet it felt alien, as if the house had shifted slightly in our absence, rearranging its bones to better suit its new, empty state. Our first task was the decorations. Our mother had been a Halloween enthusiast, a trait Jackie had inherited, and I had always found vaguely unsettling. In the attic, amidst the ghosts of Christmases past, we found the boxes. They were labeled in our Mother S looping script: Halloween scary, Halloween cute. The dichotomy was pure mom. Jackie pulled out a string of orange and purple lights. We should put these up for the trick-or-treaters. Are we staying that long? I asked, the thought a sudden, cold stone in my gut. The sale wasn't for another 2 weeks. It's next week, Garrett. The realtor said it's good for the neighborhood vibe. Makes the place look lived in. She didn't look at me as she said it, her fingers tracing the outline of a plastic bat. So we decorated. We draped the synthetic cobwebs over the bushes, the sticky fibers clinging to our hands like ghostly residue. We hung the plastic skeletons, their bones clicking together with a sound too much like the real thing. And we carved the pumpkins, a whole bushel of them, bought from a roadside stand that looked as if it had sprouted from the very soil of the season. The act of carving was a ritual I had forgotten. The slick, cold feel of the pumpkin S innards, the stringy, seed-clotted pulp that smelled of wet earth and faintly of decay. Jackie worked with a Surgeon S precision, creating a classic triangle-eyed ghoul. My own hands felt clumsy. The knife slipped, and the mouth I carved became a ragged, lopsided sneer, a wound more than a smile. As I scooped out the last handful of pulp, my fingers brushed against something hard and smooth, buried deep in the orange flesh. It was a small, black river stone, worn perfectly oval by water and time. It was cold, unnaturally so, and it seemed to drink the light from the room. I almost showed it to Jackie, but some instinct, that same Child S voice from the airport, told me to keep it secret. I slipped it into my pocket, where it sat like a weight, a forgotten promise. That night, the house began to breathe. I lay in my old bedroom, the one that faced the backyard, and listened. The wind had picked up, moaning in the eaves, rattling the loose window pane in its frame. But beneath that, there was another sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping, like a branch against the roof, except the nearest tree was 20 feet away. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, Perhaps it was the house settling, its old timbers contracting in the October cold. Perhaps it was the pipes, groaning their metallic complaints. It was uncertain. The lack of clarity was a lullaby, a whispered assurance that nothing was wrong, even as my every nerve screamed that everything was. The days bled together, a slow countdown to the 31st. The town leaned into the holiday, the decorations multiplying, the atmosphere thickening. Everywhere, the jack-o'-lanterns watched with their fiery eyes. Their grins seemed to widen as the moon swelled in the sky, a great, pockmarked orange globe that hung low over the town, a harbinger. Jackie found the photo album in our father's desk. We sat on the dusty living room floor, the album open between us like a sacred text. There we were, frozen in time. Me as a vampire, fake blood dribbling down my chin. Jackie as a ballerina, her tutu a puff of pink tulle. Our parents, younger, smiling, their arms around us. But in every Halloween photo, there was a shadow. A dark smudge at the edge of the frame. A blur in the background of a shot of our house. In one picture, taken when I was maybe 7, the shadow seemed to have form tall, thin, its head cocked at an impossible angle. It stood just behind my mother, who was laughing, completely unaware. Probably just a developing error, Jackie said, but her voice was too quick, too thin, or a trick of the light. Probably, I agreed, the stone in my pocket feeling suddenly heavier. The memories surfaced more frequently now, unbidden and unwelcome. The year I was convinced my clown costume was moving on its own in the closet. The Halloween Jackie swore she saw a face, pale and long, peering from the basement window well. We had laughed it off then, called it the Halloween heebie-jeebies. But sitting in the silent, dusty house, with the orange glow of the season pressing against the windows, those childhood fears felt less like imagination and more like premonition. On October 30th, the doorbell rang. It was late afternoon, the sky a deep, bruised purple. A group of trick-or-treaters stood on our porch, a small ghost, a superhero, and a witch. Their parents waited at the end of the walkway. I dropped candy into their outstretched bags, the cheap, waxy chocolate and neon-colored taffy. The witch, a little girl with serious eyes, looked past me into the dark hallway of the house. "Your friend is scary," she said. I turned. The hallway was empty. "I don't have a friend in there, honey." "The tall one," she insisted, pointing a finger tipped with a plastic green nail. "In the shadow. He's waiting for the candy, too." A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air traced the length of my spine. I forced a smile. Happy Halloween. That night, the scraping in the walls was louder. It was joined by another sound, a faint, wet, crunching noise, like someone chewing on something brittle. It seemed to come from the heating vents. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel that had found its way into the crawlspace. It was the most logical explanation. It had to be. I pressed a pillow over my head, but the sounds seeped through. A symphony of the house's hidden life. Halloween morning dawned cold and bright. The sunlight was a liar, sharp and clean, but couldn't he dispel the gloom that clung to the house? Jackie was quiet, her face pale. She had dark smudges under her eyes. We worked in silence, bagging up old clothes for donation, boxing up books. The tension between us was a physical thing, a third presence in the room. It was while I was clearing out the hall closet that I found it. Tucked behind a stack of old winter coats, its surface furry with dust, was a small wooden box. It was unadorned, but it felt ancient. The latch was stiff, but it gave with a groan. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were more of the Black River stones, dozens of them. And nestled among them, a faded black and white photograph of a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothes. His face was long, his eyes deep-set and dark, and he held a hat in his hands. He was standing on our front porch. My blood ran cold. I knew him, not from life, but from the shadows in the photo album, from the vague, formless shape of a childhood nightmare. I showed the box to Jackie. Her face crumpled. "I remember now," she whispered, her voice cracking. Mom called him the Harvest Man. She said he was a story, a legend to make Halloween scarier. She said he came on Halloween night to collect offerings. Offerings? I asked, the stone in my pocket burning a hole through the fabric. Candy, she said, her eyes wide with a remembered terror. But not the candy. The spirit inside it. The joy, the fear. He feeds on the energy of the night, she said. She said we had to leave a bowl out for him, on the porch, every year to keep him happy, to keep him out of the house. We looked at each other, the unspoken truth hanging in the air between us. Our mother, with her love for the macabre, her collection of odd folklore. Had she been playing a game? Or had she been practicing something older, darker? The Harvest Man. The thought was not my own, but it was there, fully formed. He was the reason for the decorations. The pumpkins were his eyes. The candy was his tribute. The house was his altar. The day bled away. The sun sinking below the horizon, as if pulled down by invisible strings. The night of October 31st arrived. The transformation was immediate and absolute. The street filled with costumed children, their laughter sharp and brittle on the cold air. The orange glow of the jack-o'-lanterns became the only light, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. The air hummed with a strange, ancient energy. The veil was thin. You could feel it, a pressure in the air, a static charge on the skin. We did our duty. We handed out candy. But our hearts weren't in it. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to shift when I looked away. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep. The wind sounded like whispering. At precisely 8 o'clock, the doorbell fell silent. The last of the trick-or-treaters had gone home, their bags heavy with loot. The street was empty, littered with discarded wrappers and the occasional lost mask. We stood in the living room, the silence of the house, a physical weight. "We should leave," I said. "We can stay at a hotel, finish this in the morning, and do what, Garrett?" Jackie's voice was hollow. "Leave a bowl of candy on the porch, like Mom always did." She went to the kitchen and returned with a large ceramic mixing bowl. She filled it with the remaining candy, a colorful, shiny mound. She walked to the front door and opened it. The cold night air rushed in, smelling of wood smoke and frost. She placed the bowl on the porch, right in the center, where the glow from our lopsided jack-o'-lanterns could illuminate it. She closed the door and locked it. The click of the bolt was absurdly final. We waited. The house was too quiet. The normal sounds, the furnace, the fridge had all ceased. The only thing we could hear was the frantic thumping of our own hearts. The orange light from the pumpkins outside bled through the windows, painting the walls in shifting patterns of light and dark. Then the doorbell rang, a single, clear chime that shattered the silence. Jackie and I froze. We looked at each other. No one should be out this late. The town had a curfew for a reason. It rang again, insistent. I moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. The porch was empty. The bowl of candy sat, untouched. "It's nothing," I whispered. "Just kids playing a prank." The doorbell rang a third time, longer now. A sustained, angry buzz. And then, from the basement, came a sound that stopped my heart. A soft, shuffling drag, like something heavy being pulled across the concrete floor. Something that had been down there all along, waiting for the veil to thin enough for the offerings to be made. The lock on the basement door began to turn. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key lock, and we could see the brass knob twisting, slowly, deliberately. Jackie let out a small, choked sound. We backed away toward the kitchen, but the shuffling was there too, coming from the pantry. It was in the walls, a dry, scraping rustle that was now unmistakably the sound of movement. The harvest man was not outside. He was in the house. He had always been in the house. The decorations weren't for him. They were of him. The pumpkins were his eyes because he saw through the rot. The cobwebs were his tapestry. The house was not just haunted. It was inhabited. It was a living, breathing entity, and he was its heart. The basement door swung open with a long, mournful creak. The thing that stood there was not a man. It was the essence of the season given form. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs like knotted branches. Its skin was the mottled, rough texture of tree bark, and its head was a grotesque, featureless oval, smooth and pale like a river stone. It smelled of cold soil, of rotting leaves, of the waxy inside of a pumpkin. It held no weapon. It needed none. Its presence was a vacuum, sucking the warmth and the light from the room. It took a step forward, its movement a dry rustle. It was not looking at us with eyes it did not have, but we felt its attention, a pressure that made the air hum. It was Jackie who moved first. She grabbed the ceramic bowl from the side table, the one she had just filled, and she threw it. It sailed through the air in a shower of chocolate and candy corn, and shattered against the thing's chest. It stopped, the faceless head tilted. It raised a long, twig-like hand and brushed at the sugary mess on its bark-like skin. Then, It made a sound. A low, wet, crunching noise, exactly like the one I had heard in the vents. It was feeding, not on the candy, but on the memory of the joy that had created it, the anticipation, the tiny, sweet fears of the children who had received it. It took another step toward us, and the hunger in the air became a physical force. I remembered the stone in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was no longer cold. It was warm, almost hot, and it pulsed with a faint orange light, like the ember of a candle deep within a pumpkin. The thing, the harvest man, turned its smooth head toward me. It was not an offering. It was an invitation, a connection. My mother had not been trying to keep it out. She had been trying to bind it, to channel it, using the house as a vessel, the Halloween rituals as a focusing lens. The stones were anchors, and I was holding one. The thing stretched out its hand, not in threat, but in expectation. "Garrett, no," Jackie screamed. But it was too late. The pull was irresistible. It was the call of the rotting leaves, the whisper of the bare branches, the finality of the harvest. It was the truth of Halloween, the beautiful, terrible truth that everything must die, and that from that death, something else must feed. I took a step forward, then another. The distance between us closed. I placed the warm, black stone into its open, wooden palm. Its fingers closed around mine. They were not rough, but smooth and cold like polished granite. A jolt went through me, a shock of pure, ancient cold. Visions flashed behind my eyes. 1,000 Halloweens, 1,000 bowls of candy, 1,000 grinning pumpkins, my mother's face, young and afraid, placing a stone in a box, my own small hand reaching for a piece of candy, the shadow watching from the corner, always watching, always hungry. The house was not just a house. It was a throat, and we were the food it had grown for itself. The cold spread up my arm, into my chest, into my heart. It did not hurt. It was a vast, quiet emptiness. I felt my memories being siphoned away. The joy and the terror of every Halloween I had ever known. All the energy of this one, sacred night, flowing out of me and into the silent, waiting thing that held my hand. The last thing I saw was Jackie's face, a mask of horror, as the thing that was once me turned toward her, its smooth, stone head reflecting the dying glow of the jack-o'-lanterns. The thought arrived not as my own, but as a cold, smooth stone placed on the tongue of my mind. The house is hungry again. I was halfway across the country, staring at the blank, indifferent face of a hotel room wall when it surfaced. It was a child's thought, phrased in a child's simple, terrifying logic, and it tasted of wax and rotting pumpkin. It was October 22nd. The flight attendant's voice, a tinny recording from the past, echoed in my memory, telling me to return my seat to its upright position. I was already upright. I had been for years, but now, hurtling back to Hemlock Creek, I felt the old slouch of dread settling into my spine. On the porch, my sister waited, a silhouette against the bright rectangle of the open front door. And behind her, in the deep shadows of the hall, Something tall and patient, and made of stone and shadow, waited with her. She didn't smile when I got out of the car. The air was different here, thicker, carrying the scent of wet leaves, and something else, something sweetly metallic, like a penny on the tongue. Jackie just stared, her eyes holding a flat, polished sheen, like the river stones from the box. "You ray late," she said. Her voice was the same, but the rhythm was off, the cadence borrowed. "The flight was delayed," I said, my own voice a stranger-s the thought. "The house is hungry again," looped in my head, a silent mantra I hadn't chosen. She turned and walked inside, and I had no choice but to follow. The foyer was dim, the familiar wallpaper now a pattern of shadows that seemed to writhe if I didn't look directly at them. The house was not silent. It was full of a low, subterranean hum, the sound of a deep and patient digestion. I dropped my bag by the stairs, the thud unnaturally absorbed by the stillness. "He has been waiting," Jackie said, leading me toward the kitchen. She moved with a new, fluid grace, her steps making no sound on the creaky floorboards. I realized the house had stopped creaking for her. In the kitchen, the table was set for two. A single fat candle, the color of a blood orange, guttered in the center. The meal was simple. A stew that smelled of rich earth and roasted roots. A thick, dark bread. It was the kind of food our mother would make in the weeks leading up to the holiday. Food that stuck to your ribs and made you feel heavy, grounded. "We have to prepare," Jackie said, sitting and picking up her spoon. "The offerings must be perfect this year. The veil is thinner than it has ever been." I sat across from her. "Jackie, what happened? What did it do to you?" She looked up, and for a fleeting second, the real her flickered in her eyes. A trapped thing screaming from behind a pane of glass. "It didn't do anything, Garrett. It showed me. It showed me the purpose, the cycle." Her hand trembled as she brought the spoon to her lips. "It is beautiful in its way. The harvest must always be gathered." The stew tasted of memory, of the cold air, the night I got my first real bike, of the smell of my father's pipe tobacco, of the sharp, clean pain of a scraped knee. It was every potent, fleeting feeling of childhood distilled into a broth. I ate it because I was hungry, a deep, cellular hunger I hadn't known was there. After the meal, she led me to the living room. The wooden box was on the coffee table, its lid open. The remaining stones glinted in the candlelight. "It is time you learned your part," she said. Her voice was blending with another, deeper tone, a resonance that came from the very walls. "You are the anchor now. I am the gate. Together, we make the house whole." She picked up a stone and pressed it into my hand. It was warm, vibrating with a low, dormant power. "The children will come. They will bring their laughter and their little fears. You will take the stone and you will touch their treats. Just a brush. It seals the offering. It prepares the sustenance." The plan was monstrous. It was a perversion of the entire ritual, turning the innocent act of trick-or-treating into a direct line of feeding. My stomach turned, but the stew sat heavily within me, a comforting, sedative weight. "No," I whispered. The house seemed to contract around us. The hum deepened into a growl. The candle flame stretched itself thin and tall, casting the long, thin shadow of the harvest man against the far wall. It didn't move. It just was. A promise. A threat. Jackie S.'s face went slack, all traces of my sister vanishing. "There is no," the thing using her voice said. "You are part of the house. Your resistance is a spice. It makes the final offering all the richer." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the shadow and the box of stones. I looked down at the one in my hand. It was no longer just warm. It was hot, and in its depths, I could see a tiny, flickering light, a captured ember of some long-forgotten joy. It was my own. From the year I was a pirate, and my father had carried me on his shoulders when my legs got tired. I closed my fingers around it. The heat was a brand. I was not the anchor. I was the next meal. And my sister was the one who was going to serve me. The days bled together in a haze of preparation. We did not pack or clean. We decorated. Under Jackie S.'s direction, I carved pumpkins, my hands moving with an unnerving skill I did not possess. The faces I carved were not the simple triangles of my youth. They were twisted, agonized masks, their grins too wide, their eyes deep, knowing slits. We hung fake cobwebs, but they clung to my fingers with a strange, sticky persistence, as if they were not entirely fake. The house was transforming, leaning into its own true nature, and we were its willing hands. Jackie was a ghost of my sister, a puppet with glazed eyes. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was about the ritual, the importance of the alignment, the quality of the fear. She no longer ate normal food. She would stand in the pantry, her back to me, and I would hear the soft, wet, crunching sounds. I never saw what she was eating. The stone in my pocket was a constant, burning presence. It was my tether to myself, a reminder of the joy it had stolen. At night, the sounds in the walls were no longer scratches. They were whispers. They were the echoes of every child who had ever taken a piece of candy from this porch, their fleeting moments of Halloween magic, now a permanent part of the house S. larder. I heard my own voice among them, a small, excited shout from 20 years ago. On the afternoon of the 31st, Jackie laid out my costume. It was not a costume. It was one of our Father S. old suits, smelling of mothballs and dust. "You need to look the part," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "The provider, the friendly face, it makes the transition smoother." I put it on. The sleeves were too short, the shoulders too tight. I looked in the hall mirror and saw a stranger, a gaunt man playing dress-up in his dead Father S. clothes. Behind my reflection, deep in the glass, a taller, darker shape shifted and settled. As dusk fell, the first of the children arrived. Their laughter was like shattering glass. Jackie stood behind me, a silent sentinel just inside the door, a large, empty bowl in her hands. My role was simple. I was to smile. I was to drop the candy into their bags. And with my other hand, the one holding the warm, black stone, I was to lightly brush the top of their treats. The first little girl, dressed as a butterfly, held out her pillowcase. Trick or treat. Her voice was bright, full of untainted excitement. Happy Halloween, I said, my own voice a hollow imitation of warmth. I dropped a handful of chocolate bars into her bag. My left hand, clenched around the stone, swept over the opening. A faint, orange spark, invisible to her, jumped from my fist and danced across the wrappers before fading. The girl didn't notice. She giggled and ran off. But I felt it. A tiny, vibrant thread of her joy, a silken cord of energy, snap taut between her and the house. It thrummed with life, and I felt the house sigh in satisfaction. I looked at my hand. The stone was glowing brighter. I did it again, and again. A superhero, a ghost, a tiny dinosaur. With each offering, the stone in my hand grew warmer, heavier. The threads of energy multiplied until the air on the porch was thick with them, a shimmering, invisible web. I could feel every child connected to it, their collective excitement, a roaring fire that fed directly into the walls of the house. The hum grew louder, a deep, contented purr. Jackie watched, her empty bowl held out like an invitation. Her eyes were now fully black, polished stones, reflecting the dying light. Finally, the last trick-or-treater was gone. The street was silent. The web of energy glowed fiercely in my mind's eye, a brilliant, terrible net. The house was sated, drunk on stolen joy. Jackie stepped forward onto the porch. "It is time for the final offering," she said. She was not looking at me, but past me, into the house. The hunger in the air did not abate. It shifted. It was no longer a general appetite. It was a specific, focused craving, the main course. I knew then that the candy, the children's joy, was just the appetizer. The harvest man fed on the energy of the night, but his true sustenance, the thing that sustained him through the long, barren year, was the terror of the anchor, the one who bound him to this world, the one who had invited him in. I was the final treat. I turned from the door, from my sister's vacant stare, and looked into the living room. The harvest man stood in the center of the room, no longer a shadow, but fully, terribly present. He was more substantial now, his bark-like skin gleaming, his smooth head tilted toward me. The threads of light from the web of children's joy all led directly to him, feeding him, making him whole. He stretched out his long wooden hand, not for the stone, for me. Jackie spoke from behind me, her voice the sound of dead leaves scraping on pavement. "The house is grateful for your service." I took a step backward, but the porch railing was at my back. There was nowhere to go. The web of energy held me fast, a fly caught in its own trap. The warmth from the stone in my hand was now a searing heat, and I knew it was burning the last of my own stolen joy, using it as a beacon to call me home. The harvest man took a step forward, and the distance between us vanished. His smooth, featureless face was inches from mine. I could smell the cold, deep earth of his breath. I closed my eyes, waiting for the cold, for the emptiness, for the final harvest. But instead of his touch, I heard a new sound. A small, insistent crunching. I opened my eyes. The little girl from before, the butterfly, was standing on our walkway. She had dropped her pillowcase. A single, stone-kissed chocolate bar lay at her feet, its wrapper torn open. She was staring past me into the house at the harvest man. Her face was a perfect, pristine mask of a terror, so pure it was almost holy. And the harvest man turned his head. The focused hunger that had been pinning me in place wavered. The threads of energy from the other children were bright, but this was a different quality. This was a raw, undiluted fear, the kind that legends are made of. It was a rare vintage. He hesitated, his outstretched hand hovering between me and the child. In that split second, I saw my chance. It was not an act of courage, but of desperation, the last twitch of a condemned man. I didn't throw the stone at him. I threw it at the little girl. It arced through the air, a black streak of captured memory, and landed at her feet with a soft thud in the damp grass. The harvest man made a sound, a low, grinding groan of immense need. He forgot me entirely. He flowed past me, a wave of cold soil and decay, his entire being focused on the child and the potent, terrifying energy she radiated, now amplified and anchored by the stone I had given her. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I shoved past Jackie, who stood frozen, her empty bowl clattering to the porch floor. I ran down the driveway, past the silent, watching houses, the threads of the web snapping behind me. I didn't look back. I knew what was in the house. I knew what was in my sister. And I knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep into the hollow where my joy used to be, that the house was still hungry. It would always be hungry, and I had just shown it a new way to be fed. The cold night air was a shock, a physical slap that did nothing to cleanse me. It was October air, the same air that had filled my lungs on 1,000 other nights, but now it felt thin, used up. The street was empty, the Halloween decorations suddenly sinister and mocking. A plastic skeleton dangling from a tree seemed to twist its head to watch me flee. I ran without direction, my father-esque suit jacket flapping around me, the burned-out stone in my pocket, a cold, dead weight. I had not saved that little girl. I had merely offered her in my place. I had refined the ritual, made it more efficient. The harvest man had always fed on the lingering echoes of joy and fear left in the candy. I had discovered he preferred it fresh. I found myself at the edge of the old creek, the one the town was named for. The water was black and slow-moving. I fell to my knees, gasping, and vomited into the weeds. It wasn't food. It was a thin, bitter fluid that tasted of wax and soil and a metallic fear. When I was done, I wiped my mouth and saw my hands were shaking not from exhaustion, but from a deep cellular withdrawal. The house had been feeding me too. The stew, the atmosphere, it had all been part of it, making me a part of its ecosystem. Now I was cut off, and my body was screaming for that connection. A branch snapped in the woods behind me. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering. It wasn't the heavy, deliberate tread of the harvest man. This was lighter, quicker. A figure emerged from the tree line, silhouetted against the distant glow of the town. It was Mr. Henderson, our elderly neighbor. He was holding a flashlight, its beam cutting a wobbly path through the dark. He looked pale and frightened. "Garrett," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "That you, son? I saw you running. Everything all right?" For a moment, a wild, desperate hope flared in me. A connection to the normal world. I could tell him everything. I took a step toward him, ready to spill the insane, terrible truth. Then the beam of his flashlight passed over my face, and he flinched. He took a stumbling step backward. "Your eyes," he whispered. "Lord, boy, what's wrong with your eyes?" I turned and looked at my reflection in the dark water of the creek. The moon was bright enough to see. My face was my own, gaunt and terrified. But my eyes were not. They were flat and black, polished to a dull sheen, just like the stones from the box. Just like Jackie S. I wasn't free. I had never been free. The change had already happened. I was the anchor. I had carried the stone. I had performed the ritual, and a part of the harvest man was now anchored to me. I had become a vessel, a siphon. Wherever I went, I would carry the hunger with me. Mr. Henderson was still backing away, making a sign against evil, the flashlight beam jittering wildly. "Don't come near the house, Mr. Henderson," I said, and my voice had a new quality, a gravelly resonance that was not my own. It was the voice of the house, speaking through me. "The harvest isn't over." I turned from his terrified face and began to walk, not away from town, but back toward it. The hunger was a compass in my chest, pulling me forward. I wasn't running from the house anymore. I was its agent. The stone in my pocket was cold, but the one in my soul was warm and pulsing, and it was already looking for the next offering, the next thread of joy to sever, the next morsel of fear to consume. The house was hungry, and I was its new, mobile mouth. The streetlights hummed a different tune now, a high-pitched whine that grated against the low, insistent thrum inside my skull. I walked down the center of the road, a gaunt scarecrow in a dead man S-suit. Porch lights winked out as I passed. Doors locked with soft, decisive clicks. The town was instinctively recoiling, sensing a predator it did not have a name for. I didn't look at the houses. I looked at the remnants of the night. A discarded plastic mask, its grin smeared with mud. A shattered pumpkin, its candle extinguished. A single gleaming piece of candy still in its wrapper, dropped in the panic of a Child S flight. I felt a pull toward it, a magnetic need. My hand, moving with a will that was not entirely my own, dipped down and picked it up. The wrapper was cool and slick. I didn't open it. I just held it, my black eyes fixed on its colorful surface. And I felt it. A tiny, fading echo of anticipation. The ghost of a child's hope for a sweet treat. It was a crumb, but my new hunger latched onto it, savoring the faint flavor. The stone in my soul warmed a fraction of a degree. This was how it would be. I would be a scavenger, a gleaner in the fields of ordinary life, feeding on the scraps of emotion left behind. But scraps would not be enough. The hunger was a bottomless pit. The memory of the little butterfly's pure, undiluted terror was a banquet, and it had ruined me for anything less. I found myself standing across the street from the elementary school. The playground was empty, the swings moving slightly in the wind. Tomorrow, it would be full of children. Their laughter would ring out, a chaotic symphony of unguarded joy. The thought made the hunger twist inside me, a painful, beautiful ache. I could walk among them, a strange, quiet man. I could brush against their backpacks. I could pat ahead. With each touch, I could transfer a spark, plant a seed of the stone's essence. It would lie dormant, a sleeper agent in their happiness, waiting for a moment of fear to activate it, to create a conduit straight back to me. To him, a car turned onto the street, its headlights piercing the gloom. It was a police cruiser. It slowed as it approached me. The window rolled down. Officer Miller, a man who had coached my little league team, looked out. His friendly, familiar face was set in a mask of professional caution. "Garrett, that you?" he asked. "We got a call about a disturbance. Everything okay? You don't look well." I tried to form words, to tell him I was fine, to send him away. But the thing inside me saw his concern, his steady, grounded calmness. It was a different flavor, a hearty, savory meal compared to the sugary joy of children. The hunger wanted it. "The harvest isn't over," I said, the house's voice grinding through my vocal cords. His hand went to his radio. His eyes widened as they fully met mine in the glare of his headlights. He saw the polished black stones staring back at him. I took a step toward the car. He drew his sidearm, his movements swift and trained. "Stop right there, Garrett. Stop right there." I didn't stop. The hunger was a tide, and I was just a piece of driftwood on its surface. I took another step. The fear rolling off him now was exquisite, a dark and complex roast. It was better than the child's fear. It had the weight of responsibility, the sharp tang of confusion. I said stop. He yelled, his voice cracking. I was at the driver's side door. I looked down at him, not as Garrett, but as the anchor. I raised my hand, the one that had held the stone, and placed it flat against the window. The glass didn't break. It fogged, then frosted, a spiderweb of cold radiating from my palm. The fear on his face solidified into pure, uncomprehending horror. He tried to speak into his radio, but only a static gasp came out. I felt the connection form. A thick, cold cord of his terror, like a frozen rope, snapped taut between his heart and mine. I drank it in. It was sustenance. It was power. The hum inside me grew louder, more confident. When I pulled my hand away, the frost pattern on the glass remained, a perfect, crystalline replica of my palm print. Officer Miller was slumped over the wheel, unconscious, his face pale and waxy. He was alive, but he was empty. I had harvested him. I turned and continued my walk, leaving the cruiser idling in the street. The hunger was quiet for now, sated, but I knew it would return. It was always there, a patient, grinding need. The house had its gate in my sister, and now it had its harvester in me. The cycle would continue. It was, as Jackie had said, beautiful in its way. I understood that now. I was part of the beautiful, terrible machine, and my work had only just begun. The silence that followed was deeper than any I had known. It was the silence of a predator digesting its meal. I walked on, the soles of my Father S. dress shoes making a soft, rhythmic tap on the asphalt, a sound that was both mundane and monstrous. I was a new kind of creature, a paradox of the ordinary and the occult, and the town slept around me, unaware that its ecosystem had just gained a new, permanent predator. I found myself drawn not to the outskirts, but to the heart of the town, to the small, well-kept park with its bronze statue of the founder. My body moved with a purpose I did not consciously understand, a homing instinct guided by the stone lodged in my soul. I sat on a cold iron bench, the same bench where I had eaten ice cream as a child, and looked at my hands. They looked the same. The nails, the lines on the palms. But they were instruments of harvest now. A young couple stumbled out of a bar, laughing, leaning on each other for support. Their joy was a bright, fizzy thing in the night air, a beacon. The hunger inside me, momentarily quieted by Officer Miller's fear, stirred again. It was a faint pang, a reminder that the feast was over and the foraging would soon begin anew. I watched them, not with malice, but with a profound, detached need. They were food. That was all. The girl's laughter cut off abruptly as she noticed me sitting in the shadows. Creepy, she muttered, pulling her boyfriend along. The word was a gift. A small, spicy morsel of unease. I absorbed it, and the pang of hunger subsided. This was my existence now. A constant, low-level grazing on the emotional field of the world, punctuated by the occasional, necessary harvest. As the first hint of dawn tinged the sky, I stood. The suit was rumpled and smelled of night, and something faintly of loam. I needed a place to go. My home was a feeding ground, occupied by my sister and her master. I could not return there, but the anchor stone in my chest pulled me toward a different location, a place that had been part of the cycle long before I was. I walked to the old part of town, to the cemetery. The iron gates were locked, but that was no obstacle. I simply placed my hand on the metal, and the lock inside froze, then shattered with a quiet crack. I pushed the gate open. The air in the cemetery was thick and still. I walked past headstones, my feet finding a path without my eyes needing to guide them. I stopped before a large, flat granite slab, older than any of the ornate markers around it. It was unmarked, but I knew what it was. The foundation stone. The first stone. The one upon which our house and the thing inside it had been built. I knelt and placed my palms flat on the cold, rough surface. A jolt of power, ancient and vast, shot up my arms. This was the root of the hunger. This was the wellspring. Images flooded my mind, other anchors, other harvesters, stretching back through generations. My father's face flashed before me, not as I remembered him, but with the same black, polished eyes I now saw in the creek. He had not been a victim. He had been the previous harvester. He had grown old and empty, and the house had needed a new vessel. It had chosen his son. It had always been going to choose me. A presence solidified behind me. I didn't need to turn. I could feel her. A smaller, colder hunger connected to the larger one. "You understand now," Jackie said. Her voice was still a rustle, but there was a note of something almost like relief in it. It's easier when you understand. He was the harvester before me, I said, my voice still not entirely my own. He was, and his father before him. It is the duty of our line to feed the house, to sustain the harvest man. She came to stand beside me, looking down at the stone. The candy, the children, that was just the awakening. The true harvest is the fear of the town. You have begun the real work. I looked at her. She seemed smaller in the gray dawn, frail. She was the gate, the stationary heart of the operation. But I was the hand. I was the one who would go out into the world and reap. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "you find a home. You live your life. You become a part of the community. And when the hunger calls, you answer." She gestured toward the waking town below. "They are the crop. We are the farmers. It is a simple arrangement." She turned and walked away, back toward the house, leaving me alone with the foundation stone and my new, terrible purpose. The sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows from the headstones. It was a new day, a new season. I stood up, brushing the grave dust from my trousers. I had a lot to do. I needed to find an apartment. I needed to get a job. I needed to weave myself back into the fabric of the town, not as Garrett, the man who lived in the creepy house on the hill, but as a quiet, unassuming neighbor, someone who would always be there in a moment of crisis, ready to offer a comforting hand, a steadying word. And with that touch, I would plant a seed, a tiny black seed of dread that would wait, patient and silent, for the perfect moment to bloom into a harvest of pure, sustaining terror. The walk back into the waking town felt like putting on a familiar, yet ill-fitting, skin. The dawn light was harsh, exposing every smudge of dirt on my suit, every hollow in my face. People were starting their days, unlocking shop doors, fetching newspapers from dew-damp lawns. They glanced at me, a disheveled man in a formal suit at 7 in the morning, and then quickly looked away. Their flicker of unease was a thin, satisfying broth. I found a cheap studio apartment above the hardware store. The landlord, a man named Dave, with a perpetual coffee stain on his shirt, didn't he ask many questions. The fear of a bad credit score was greater than his fear of me. When I shook his hand to seal the deal, I let a sliver of the coldness seep into him. Just a taste. He'd have a nightmare tonight, a vague one about falling, and he'd wake feeling tired. I was marking my territory. The job was easier. The old library was underfunded and needed a night janitor. The head librarian, Mrs. Gable, was a kind, tired woman who smelled of paper and dust. She was sympathetic when I told her I was new in town and needed a quiet job. She didn't look too closely at my eyes. When she offered me the position, I made sure to infuse my gratitude with a subtle, clinging melancholy. She would go home and feel a sudden, unexplained sadness for her long-dead cat. It was practice. I was learning the nuances of my new craft. My days fell into a pattern. I slept through the mornings, the black stone in my soul, a heavy, dormant weight. I rose in the afternoon and walked the town, a silent, observant figure. I learned its rhythms. I knew which couples argued behind closed doors, which teenagers felt the gnawing anxiety of their future, which elderly residents were brittle with the fear of being forgotten. I was a cartographer of despair. At night, I cleaned the library. The silence was a canvas for the low hum of my hunger. I would run a dust cloth over the encyclopedias, my touch leaving behind a faint, psychic residue. A child researching a school project might later feel a sudden, chilling dread about the vastness of the universe. It was a slow, patient sowing, but the hunger demanded more than these scattered seeds. It needed a true harvest. The opportunity came a month later. A young couple, Mark and Sarah, moved into the apartment next to mine. They were bright, optimistic, their lives a symphony of plans and shared laughter. Their happiness was a constant, low-grade irritation, a bright light I needed to extinguish. I was polite. I helped them carry a sofa up the stairs. I accepted their invitation for coffee. Sitting in their sunlit apartment, surrounded by unpacked boxes and their hopeful chatter, the hunger coiled tight in my chest. It was time. I focused on Sarah. She was talking about her garden, about the flowers she would plant. I let my gaze rest on her, and I pushed. It wasn't a violent thing. It was a whisper. A single, cold thought injected directly into the warm soil of her mind. It was the memory of the little girl S. terror from Halloween, refined and sharpened. For a split second, Sarah S.'s smile didn't just fade, it shattered. Her eyes went wide with a horror she could not name or comprehend. The joyful memory of planning her garden was instantly and permanently tainted by a primal, inexplicable fear. She gasped and dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the floor. Mark was at her side. "Honey, what's wrong?" She was crying, trembling, unable to explain. The thread of her joy had been severed. The harvest was complete. I stood, making a show of concern. I should go. It must be the stress of the move. As I walked out, I felt the energy flow into me. It was rich, complex. The terror of a happy person is the most potent of all. I was sated, powerful. Back in my own dark apartment, I stood by the window and watched their lights. The hum inside me was a contented purr. Later that night, a soft knock came at my door. It was Jackie. She looked more substantial now, her form less like a shadow. The harvests were strengthening her, strengthening the house. She didn't need to ask. She could feel the fullness in me. She smiled, a thin, bloodless curve of her lips. "The first fruit of the new season is always the sweetest," she whispered. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, new stone, identical to the one inside me, but dull and lifeless. "It's time to prepare for the next," she said. "The cycle continues." I took the stone. It was cold and inert, a promise of future hunger. I closed my fingers around it, and I knew my work was never done. I was the harvester. The town was my field, and the growing season had just begun. Story 3. In the corner of the attic, beneath a shroud of dust that tasted of decades and dried pine needles, rested a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was unadorned, the color of a long-faded bruise, and it lay nestled between a crate of mildewed Christmas ornaments and a broken rocking horse, as if it had been waiting, with infinite patience, for a specific October to arrive. The dust was a soft, gray skin, and when a stray beam of late afternoon light pierced the single attic window, it illuminated the motes dancing above the book, a galaxy of neglect swirling around a silent, gravitational center. Downstairs, the house on Hemlock Lane was preparing for its favorite season. Francis could hear his mother humming as she arranged ceramic jack-o'-lanterns on the mantelpiece. The air was thick with the cloying, wholesome scent of baking pumpkin bread, a smell that Francis had come to despise. It was the smell of contentment, of suburban ritual, of a life that felt as hollow and mass-produced as the plastic skeletons grinning from every neighbor's lawn. He was 22, and the world had become a set of instructions he hadn't agreed to follow. College had been a blur of pointless courses. His friends were talking about 401ks and starter homes. He felt like a ghost in his own life, transparent and unheard, a spectator to a play in which he had no lines. He had come up to the attic seeking silence, or perhaps a relic of a time when things felt more real. His fingers, long and restless, brushed away the dust from the journal. The leather was cool and strangely supple. He opened it. The pages were filled with a tight, frantic script he didn't recognize, the ink a rusty brown that was not quite black. The first entry was dated October 28th, from a year he couldn't place. "The moon is a rotten pumpkin," it began. "It hangs too low, bleeding orange light through the skeletal trees. They are here again. I hear their laughter on the wind, a sound like breaking glass and forgotten songs. They call it the unmasking. Father says it is just the excitement of the season, but he lies. He has always lied. The candy tastes of ashes in my mouth. The masks are not just for hiding. They are for becoming. Francis' breath caught in his throat. This was not the sanitized, candy-coated Halloween of his childhood. This was something else, something old and feral that whispered to the emptiness inside him. He read on, the words painting pictures in the gloom of the attic. The writer spoke of a trio, a man and two women who appeared only as the veil thinned. They were beautiful and terrible, embodiments of freedom that laughed at the rules of day and night, of life and death. They offered a choice, a shedding of the mortal coil like an outgrown skin. The next few days passed in a haze for Francis. The journal became his secret scripture. He carried it with him everywhere, reading its passages under the desk, at his tedious data entry job, in the amber glow of streetlights on his walks home. The world around him began to shift, the Halloween decorations taking on a new, sinister life. The jack-o'-lanterns on the porches no longer seemed jolly. Their triangular eyes and jagged grins looked like warnings. The synthetic cobwebs draping the bushes appeared too intricate, too genuine. The laughter of costumed children playing in the twilight sounded less like joy, and more like a complex, ancient language. On the evening of the 29th, he saw them for the first time. He was walking through the town square, past the courthouse lawn littered with fake tombstones. The air was cold, carrying the sweet and sour smell of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. A harvest moon, vast and impossibly orange, dominated the sky. And there, standing by the old marble fountain, now dry and filled with dead leaves, were three figures. They were not wearing costumes, yet they were the most costumed people he had ever seen. A man tall and gaunt, with hair the color of crow feathers and eyes that held the flat, dark sheen of obsidian, wore a long, elegant coat that seemed to drink the light. With him were two women. One had hair like spun silver and a smile that promised secrets. The other was fire and earth, with curls of deep auburn and a gaze that felt like a physical touch. They were utterly still, observing the festive preparations with an air of detached, predatory amusement. They were the freedom he read about. They were the antidote to the pumpkin bread and the 401 Ks. The man's name was Lysander. The silver-haired woman was Morwenna, and the auburn-haired one was Lilith. They found Francis not because he was special, they later told him, but because he was hungry. They could smell the void in him, the yearning for something more than the cyclical death and rebirth of the suburban year. They first spoke to him outside a crowded party store, the air thick with the smell of cheap plastic and candy corn. "You look lost," Lysander said, his voice a low hum that vibrated in Francis' bones. It was not a question. Francis could only nod, his own voice trapped somewhere in the hollow of his chest. Lilith reached out and traced a cold finger down his cheek. "Everyone wears a mask. The question is, do you have the courage to never take yours off?" They began to show him their world, a world that existed in the liminal spaces of the Halloween season. took him to a forgotten cemetery on the edge of town, where the names on the stones were worn smooth by time. They did not speak of blood, not at first. They spoke of time, of watching empires rise and fall like leaves from a tree, of the exquisite pain of a sunset that would never fade, of a symphony that never ended. They spoke of the freedom from fear, from decay, from the slow, inevitable rot that was already setting into the pumpkins on every porch. This, Morwenna whispered, her breath fragrant with clove and cold earth, is the true harvest. We are the reapers of experience. We take the essence of life, and in return, we are freed from its tedious narrative. Francis was seduced. The Journal S warnings now read like invitations. His own life felt like the forgotten detail in the attic, covered in the dust of expectation. His father, Jamarcus, a quiet man who hid behind his newspaper, and the painful truth of his wife, S. long ago departure, tried to reach him. "You are different, son," Jamarcus said one morning, his voice gravelly with sleep and concern. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon, two scents that now seemed alien to Francis. "Staying out all night. You look pale." "I am just living, Dad," Francis replied, the words tasting like ash. "Something you never really did." The hurt in Jamarcus' eyes was a fleeting thing, a small, warm-blooded creature scurrying for cover. He looked away, toward the window, where a fat, carved pumpkin leered from the porch. "There are things in this town around this time of year. It is not all fun and games, Francis. Your mother she knew, before she left. She said the masks started looking back at her, but Francis wasn't listening. He was already gone, his mind filled with the cold, clear music of Lysander's voice. On October 30th, they initiated him. It happened in the old Henderson corn maze, a sprawling 10-acre tourist attraction that was closed for the night. The moon was a sliver, a claw scratch in the sky. The dried corn stalks rustled with a sound like 1,000 whispering voices, and the path seemed to shift and change behind them, the exit vanishing into the oppressive darkness. In the center of the maze, where a makeshift altar of hay bales and gourds usually stood for photo opportunities, Lysander presented him with a ceremonial cup. It was carved from a single, dark piece of wood, stained a deep, dark crimson at the bottom. "The final mask is the one beneath your skin," Lysander intoned. "To wear it forever, you must first taste the truth. This is the real trick. The treat is what comes after." The liquid in the cup was thick, coppery, and unbearably sweet. It was not wine. As it touched his lips, the world exploded into hyperclarity. The rustling of the corn became a language he could almost understand. The stars above were not distant suns, but cold, watching eyes. He felt a power surge through him, a terrifying, exhilarating vitality that made his previous existence feel like a black and white film. He was no longer a spectator. He was part of the dark pageant. The following day, Halloween itself, dawned gray and cold. Frost etched delicate, skeletal patterns on Francis's windowpane. He felt no fatigue, only a cold, humming energy. The world outside was a frenzy of final preparations. Children in partial costumes were everywhere, their excitement a palpable, electric current in the air. But Francis saw the undercurrent now. He saw the ancient fear in the eyes of parents as they watched the shadows lengthen. He saw the way the jack-o'-lantern's flames flickered not from the wind, but as if in response to some unseen presence. He avoided his father, whose silence had become a heavy, accusing thing. Instead, he sought out Faye, a girl he'd known in high school who worked at the town's occult bookshop, the Veiled Shelf. She was the only person who had ever looked at him and seen the emptiness, not as a flaw, but as a warning. The shop was a haven of incense and quiet, a stark contrast to the commercial frenzy outside. Faye looked up from a book on Celtic traditions, her eyes, the color of autumn violets, widening as he entered. "Francis," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "You ray ice cold. I can feel it from here." She came around the counter and took his hand. Her warmth was almost painful. "What have you done?" He tried to pull away, to explain the freedom, the power. He told her of Lysander, of the unmasking, of the transcendence. Transcendence. She interrupted, her voice sharp. "Francis, that not transcendence. That a surrender. You think they've given you freedom. They've just put you in a prettier cage, an eternal one. They ray vampires, not the romantic kind. The kind that are born from the old fears, the ones that fester in places where death is celebrated as a game. They ray parasites of the liminal space. They only exist fully on this one night." She gestured to a thick, old book open on her counter. It showed an illustration of 3 gaunt figures feasting at a table laden with rotting harvest fruits. They offer you the world, but they drain your soul. Your unmasking is the moment you become just like them, a hollow thing wearing the skin of a person, forever hungry, forever watching the living world from the outside. Her words were like darts of fire, piercing the cold shell he had built around himself. He thought of the journal, of the writer's terror. He thought of his father's pain, his mother's disappearance. Had she too been offered this choice? Had she taken it, or had she simply fled from it? Doubt, a feeling he thought he had transcended, began to curdle the power in his veins. Night fell, true night, the witching hour of trick-or-treating. The streets of Hemlock Lane were a river of tiny ghosts and goblins, their pillowcases and plastic buckets held open like offerings. Porch lights were beacons in the gloom, and the flickering candlelight from 100 jack-o'-lanterns made the shadows dance and writhe. The air was a symphony of laughter, shrieks, and the relentless rustle of costumes. Lysander, Morwenna, and Lilith found him standing on his own porch, watching the spectacle. They were more solid, more real than they had ever been. The world seemed to bend around them, the colors of the festivities leaching away to leave only the stark contrast of their forms against the orange and black night. "It is time, Francis," Lysander said. His smile was a gash of white in the darkness. The veil is at its thinnest. The final step is a small one, a leap of faith. Join us in the true feast. They led him away from his house, away from the safe, well-lit streets, toward the older, denser part of town, where the trees formed a canopy overhead, and the houses were dark, their windows like blind eyes. They were heading for the cemetery. The sounds of the children faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through bare branches, and the crunch of their feet on dead leaves. "Where are we going?" Francis asked, his voice small. "To meet the others," Lilith purred. "The ones who have chosen throughout the years. Your family awaits." A figure stepped from the shadows of a large oak tree, blocking their path. It was Jamarcus. He held a hefty, old-fashioned flashlight, its beam shaking slightly in his hand. In his other hand, he held the faded journal. "I know what you are," Jamarcus said, his voice trembling but firm. He was not looking at Francis, but at Lysander. "You took my Alara. 20 years ago, on this night. You won tea, take my son." Lysander laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "We did not take her, Jamarcus. She chose, just as your son is choosing. She found your life insufficient. She waits for him. She has been so patient." Francis felt the world drop out from under him. His mother, the journal. His mother had written it. She had been one of them. She was still one of them. "No," Francis whispered. "It is the only truth, Francis," Morwenna said, her voice a silken trap. "The family you sought was never the one in that little house. It is here with us, eternal." Jamarcus took a step forward. "Fight it, son. It is not freedom. It is just a different kind of death, a colder one." For a moment, suspended between the desperate, mortal love of his father and the cold, eternal promise of his mother and her kind, Francis hesitated. He saw the decades of pain in his father's eyes, the lonely vigils, the unspoken grief. He felt the terrible, seductive pull of the power coursing through him, the promise of an end to all pain, all weakness. Lysander's patience snapped. The hour is passing. The veil will thicken. Choose. And in that moment, Francis saw the truth not in Faye's words or his father's tears, but in Lysander's impatience. It was not about freedom. It was about consumption. They were as bound to their hunger as he had been to his disillusionment. They were not free, they were addicts, and they wanted him to become their new fix, to join their eternal, hollow revel. He took a step back, toward his father. Lysander's face contorted into a mask of ancient, terrible rage. The air grew cold enough to burn the lungs. The jack-o'-lanterns lining the street guttered and died, one by one, as if an unseen breath had blown them out. "Then you will be our feast instead of our family," he hissed. They moved with impossible speed, not as individuals, but as a single wave of predatory darkness. Jamarcus cried out, a short, sharp sound that was cut off. Francis felt a coldness pierce his neck, a pain so exquisite it bordered on pleasure. He felt his life, his warmth, his memories, the smell of pumpkin bread, the sound of his father's laugh, the feel of autumn sun on his skin being drawn out of him. He was a cup being emptied. The world began to fade to gray. The vibrant oranges and blacks of Halloween bleaching into monochrome. Then a new light. Not the warm, electric light of a porch bulb, but the fierce, golden light of flame. Faye was there, holding a blazing torch made of bundled sage and dried herbs. The scent was sharp, cleansing, ancient. It was the smell of borders being enforced, of veils being mended. The vampires recoiled, hissing, their beautiful faces twisting into monstrous parodies of themselves. The light and the smoke seemed to cause them physical pain, unraveling their solidity. The boundary is not yours to cross, Faye chanted, her voice strong and clear. This ground is hallowed. This life is claimed. Return to the shadows. The world snapped back. The cold retreated. The jack-o'-lantern flames flickered back to life. Lysander, Morwenna, and Lilith were gone, vanished into the deeper shadows between the trees, their forms dissipating like smoke on the wind. Francis collapsed to his knees, gasping. The cold power was gone, leaving a vast, aching weakness. Jamarcus was beside him, clutching his shoulder, a trail of blood from a shallow cut on his forehead. He was alive. He looked at his son, his eyes full of a grief, and a love so profound it was its own kind of magic. "She's really gone, isn't she?" he whispered. Francis could only nod, the truth a stone in his throat. His mother had chosen the mask, and it had consumed her. She was part of the hunger now, forever. The days that followed were quiet. The Halloween decorations came down, packed away into boxes, the festive terror replaced by the mundane approach of Thanksgiving. The world moved on, but Francis was changed. The emptiness was still there, but it was no longer a void. It was a scar, a reminder. He never felt entirely warm again. The chill of that night had seeped into his bones, a permanent autumn in his blood. He would sometimes catch his reflection in a window at dusk and startle, seeing for a moment a paler, hungrier version of himself staring back. He and his father spoke more, their conversations filled with long, comfortable silences that were no longer empty, but shared. He kept the journal. He did not hide it in the attic. He kept it on his bedside table, a totem of the choice he had made. He had chosen the messy, painful, beautiful reality of a finite life. He had chosen the love that could hurt over the power that could only consume. Months later, on a night with no particular significance, he was walking home from work. The street was dark and quiet. As he passed a narrow alleyway between two brick buildings, a scent stopped him cold. It was the smell of clove and cold earth. From the deep shadows, a voice whispered, a sound so faint it might have been the wind, but he knew it was not. It was a voice of silver and obsidian, a thread of the old cold woven into the warm night air. The voice began a sentence, a promise or a threat. He could not tell. A final lure from the world he had rejected. It spoke of eternal night and endless feast, of a family waiting in the shadows, of a mask that still had his name on it. But the voice began to fade, the words dissolving between one syllable and the next, until the last, most important word was nothing but a breath, a suggestion ancient that was swallowed by the ordinary sounds of a sleeping town. Francis did not look into the alley. He did not run. He simply stood there, feeling the chill in his bones resonate with the fading call, a tuning fork finally stilling. Then he turned and walked the rest of the way home, where the lights were on and his father was waiting. He knew the whispers would never fully stop. They were part of him now, the countermelody to his life, a cold song from the other side of the veil. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrible and comforting, that his life would be a long practice of choosing the light, not because he was blind to the dark, but because he had looked into it and turned away. The walk home was always the same now, a ritual of quiet defiance. He would pause at the alley, feel the cold pull, and then continue on. Some nights the whisper was clearer than others. Some nights it was just a feeling, a pressure at the back of his mind. Tonight it had been a word, his name, Francis, spoken in a voice that was both his mother's and a stranger's. He opened the front door to the smell of garlic and rosemary. Jamarcus was in the kitchen, roasting a chicken. It was a simple, profound act, this preparation of a meal. It was an anchor. "You're late," Jamarcus said, not turning from the oven. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Got held up," Francis replied, hanging his coat on the peg. The ordinary weight of the fabric was a comfort. His father closed the oven door and finally looked at him. His eyes, the same shade of brown as Francis's, held a new understanding, a shared language of loss and survival. "They're getting louder again," he stated. It wasn't a question. "The veil's always thinner this time of year," Francis said, repeating what Faye had told him. "Even if it's not Halloween. The equinox does it too." Jamarcus nodded slowly. "Your mother, she always loved the fall, really loved it. It wasn't just the decorations for her. It was a longing." He wiped his hands on a dish towel. "I think I understand that now. I just didn't know what she was longing for." They ate at the small kitchen table, the silence between them filled with the clinking of cutlery and the unspoken acknowledgement of the third presence in the room, the ghost of the woman who had chosen a different path. After dinner, Francis went to his room. The journal was on his bedside table, as always. He didn't open it often. He didn't need to. Its warnings were etched into him. He picked up a pen and a fresh notebook, one with plain blue cardstock covers. He opened it to the first page. The blank whiteness was a challenge. For a long time, he just stared at it, the chill in his bones seeming to intensify. A silent protest against the act of creation, of recording a mortal life. Then he began to write. not about monsters or ancient rituals, but about the taste of the chicken, the way the rosemary had crisped in the oven. He wrote about the deep lines around his father's eyes that seemed a little less burdened these days. He wrote about the way the streetlight outside his window cast the shadow of the oak tree onto his wall, a familiar, shifting pattern that was as much a part of his home as the foundation. He was writing his own story now, a counterspell to the one in the attic. It was a story of small things, of fragile, fleeting moments. It was a story of choosing the warmth of a shared meal over the cold feast of eternity. It was not a dramatic tale. It was quiet, and it was real. And with every word he wrote, the whisper from the alley outside seemed to grow just a little more distant, fading into the immense, comforting quiet of an ordinary night. The pen felt heavy in his hand, a tool not just for writing, but for anchoring himself to the world of solid things. He filled the blue notebook slowly, methodically. He described the repair of the loose step on the front porch, the specific shade of gray his father had painted it. He wrote about the way the mailman, Mr. Henderson, always whistled the same tuneless song on Tuesdays. These were the bricks and mortar of his new life, a fortress built against the whispering dark. He started visiting Faye at the veiled shelf more often, not as a frightened seeker, but as a student. She taught him about the other equinoxes, the solstices, the subtle ebbs and flows of power throughout the year. It was not magic he could wield, she explained, but knowledge he could use to understand the currents, to know when to be most vigilant. He learned that the chill in his bones was a kind of souvenir, a permanent connection to the liminal space he had almost crossed into. It was a vulnerability, but also a warning system. One evening in late spring, when the air was soft and carried the scent of lilacs, he was walking with Faye in the town park. The light was long and golden, and children were playing on the swings, their shouts echoing in the gentle air. For a moment, the scene was so perfectly, beautifully normal that the cold in his marrow felt like a distant dream. Then he saw her. She was standing under the weeping willow near the old bandstand, her form half obscured by the trailing leaves. She wore a simple summer dress, one he remembered from a photograph. Her hair was the same shade of brown as his. It was his mother. She looked exactly as she had the day she vanished, not a day older. She smiled at him, a sad, longing smile, and raised a hand in a hesitant wave. His breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. The children's laughter became shrill and distant. The warm air grew thin and cold around him. Faye's hand tightened on his arm. "Francis, what is it?" He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the apparition, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The part of him that was still a lonely boy ached to run to her, to finally have the answer to every question that had haunted his life. But the colder, wiser part of him saw the details. The way the dappled sunlight passed through her, just slightly. The way the leaves behind her were not rustled by any breeze, yet her dress stirred as if in a private wind. She was not really there. She was a projection, a lure cast from the other side. He looked away, turning his face toward Faye, focusing on the concern in her violet eyes, the real, solid warmth of her hand on his arm. He poured all his will into the moment, into the scent of lilacs, and the feel of the gravel path beneath his feet. When he dared to look back, the space under the willow was empty. Only the shadows of the leaves danced on the grass. The chill inside him flared, a sharp, painful cramp of loss, and then slowly subsided to its usual, bearable hum. He never told his father about it. Some truths were too heavy to share. Instead, he went home and wrote about it in the blue notebook. He described the exact shade of her dress, the specific way she had smiled, the devastating pull of her presence. By putting it on the page, he pinned the memory down. He made it a part of his story, not a ghost that could haunt him. He understood then that his choice was not a single, decisive event on a Halloween night. It was a choice he would have to make again and again, every day, for the rest of his life. The whispers, the visions, the chill, they were not going away. They were the price he paid for his glimpse behind the veil, and the reminder of what he had chosen to leave behind. He closed the notebook. The whisper was there, as always, a thread of silver in the quiet of his room. But beneath it, stronger now, was the sound of his own heartbeat, and the rustle of the page he had just filled. It was enough. It had to be. The following autumn was the hardest. The air turned crisp, the leaves began to bleed color, and the pumpkins appeared on porches, their carved smiles feeling less like invitations and more like grim warnings. The chill in his bones became a constant, active ache, a sympathetic vibration with the thinning veil. He found himself listening more intently to the wind, searching for syllables in its rush. Jamarcus felt it too. He started leaving more lights on in the house, a silent bulwark against the growing dark. He began cooking richer, more aromatic foods, filling the rooms with the smells of cinnamon, nutmeg, and roasting meat, as if he could fortify their home against the season itself. On the night of the harvest moon, large and orange and impossibly close, Francis woke to a sound. It was not a whisper. It was music. A faint, discordant melody played on some ancient instrument, a pipe or a flute that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was a song of wild places and hungry things, and it pulled at him with a force stronger than any memory. He rose from his bed, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. He moved through the dark house, drawn not to the door, but to the attic stairs. The music was loudest there. He climbed, each step a conscious act of will against the melody's lure. The attic was bathed in the orange light of the moon, filtering through the dusty circular window. The journal was where he had left it, but it was open. The pages were blank. The words, all the desperate warnings and seductive promises, were gone. In their place, drawn in what looked like faint silver dust, was a map. It charted the streets of his town, but it was wrong. Familiar roads ended in twisting paths that led into woods that did not exist. At the center of the map, where the old cemetery should have been, was a drawing of a bonfire, and around it, a ring of dancing figures. The music swelled, now clear and beckoning. It was coming from the map. It was an invitation to a different kind of Halloween, the true feast Lysander had promised. Francis heard a floorboard creak behind him. Jamarcus stood at the top of the stairs, his face pale in the lunar glow. He was holding the old flashlight, its plastic casing a relic from a simpler time. "I hear it too," his father said, his voice rough with sleep and fear. "You're not going alone." Francis looked from the terrifying map to his father's determined, mortal face. He nodded. This was not a choice he could make by himself. He reached out and took the flashlight from his father's hand, its solid, mundane weight a perfect counterbalance to the ethereal pull of the silver map. Together, they turned their backs on the attic and the music, descending the stairs to wait for the sunrise, outlasting the night not with magic, but with the stubborn, simple act of staying put. The music faded just before dawn, leaving behind a silence that felt earned. They did not speak of it over breakfast. The scrambled eggs and toast were a ritual of normalcy, each bite a reaffirmation of the world they had chosen. Jamarcus' hand trembled slightly as he poured the coffee, but his gaze, when it met his son S, was steady. That afternoon, Francis went to see Faye. The bell above the door of the veiled shelf chimed its usual comforting note. Faye was behind the counter, grinding dried leaves with a mortar and pestle. She looked up, her violet eyes seeing everything. "The harvest moon," she said, not as a question. "It was loud last night." Francis told her about the music, the map. The silver words vanished from the journal. He did not mention his father standing with him in the attic. That moment felt too private, too sacred to share. Faye listened, her expression grave. "The connection is stronger than I feared. They are not just whispering anymore. They are mapping your world, trying to overlay their own. The journal was a bridge. You closed the main gate, but smaller doors remain." She pushed the mortar away. "The map is a test, an invitation to a hunt you cannot win. What do I do?" "You must rewrite the boundaries," she said. "Not with their magic, with yours." She gestured to the blue notebook he carried in his satchel. "Your story is your territory. Claim it. Make it so real, so solid, that their map cannot take root." That night, Francis did not try to sleep. He sat at his desk with the blue notebook open. He began to draw his own map. He started with his house, sketching the precise number of floorboards in his hallway, the specific crack in the ceiling above his bed. He drew the kitchen, noting the exact pattern of the linoleum and the chip on the edge of the sink. He mapped his walk to work, every tree, every crack in the pavement, the particular lean of Mr. Henderson S. mailbox. He wrote descriptions next to each landmark. The smell of the damp earth in Mrs. Gable's flower bed. The sound of the faulty gutter that dripped in a syncopated rhythm against the drain pipe. The way the light from the drugstore sign reflected in a puddle on the corner, turning it a sickly, beautiful green. He was not just remembering, he was building. With every detail recorded, the chill in his bones receded a fraction. He was asserting the profound, magical truth of the ordinary. He was defining his home, not as a place on a map, but as a collection of a million insignificant, cherished details. He worked for hours until his hand ached and his eyes burned. When he finally looked up, the first gray light of dawn was touching the window. The whisper was silent. For the first time since Halloween, the silence felt absolute, not like a pause, but like a victory. He knew it was temporary. The equinox was coming. But he had his map now, and he knew how to read it. He knew the way home. The day of the equinox arrived, heavy and still. The sky was a flat, featureless gray, and the air felt thin, as if the world were holding its breath. Francis went through the motions of his day, the blue notebook a comforting weight in his bag. He felt the pull, a constant, low-grade tugging at his awareness, like a fishhook lodged deep in his soul. That evening, he and Jamarcus ate dinner with the windows closed, though the night was mild. They did not need to discuss it. The silence in the house was a shared vigil. After washing the dishes, Francis went to his room and opened the blue notebook to a fresh page. He began to write about the dinner they had just shared, the taste of the beef stew, the way his father had hummed an old song under his breath. He was in the middle of describing the steam rising from his bowl when the pen stopped. The ink simply ceased to flow. He shook it, but it was useless. A deep, unnatural cold bloomed in the center of his palm, spreading up his wrist. The whisper returned, not as a sound in his ears, but as a pressure in his mind, forming a single, clear word. Now, the light bulb in his lamp flickered and died. Moonlight, sharp and cold, streamed through the window. Outside, the familiar street was gone. In its place was the silver-drawn map from the attic. The twisted, impossible roads writhed like veins, and the woods that did not exist now stood dark and deep at the end of his street. From within those woods, he saw the flicker of the bonfire. He could feel the path under his feet, a cold, hard certainty. They were not asking him to find them anymore. They were showing him the way. The choice was no longer whether to go, but whether he had the strength to stay. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly in the silent house. He walked to his door, his movements feeling both like his own and like those of a marionette. He descended the stairs. The front door was open, though he knew Jamarcus had locked it. The autumn air that washed over him was not the air of his town. It was the air from the attic, from the mask, the air of a world without seasons. He stood on the porch, one hand on the doorframe, the threshold. Before him, the silver path gleamed, leading directly into the heart of the phantom woods. Behind him, the house was dark and quiet. He could feel his father's presence somewhere inside, a small, warm ember in the vast cold. He closed his eyes. He did not think of eternal night or endless feast. He thought of the chip in the sink. He thought of the whistling mailman. He thought of the way his father's shoulders had relaxed over dinner. He gathered these moments, these bricks of his ordinary life, and he built a wall inside his mind. He took a step back. The floorboard of the porch creaked, a familiar, comforting sound. He took another step back into the dark hallway of his home. He reached out and closed the front door. The click of the latch was a sound more powerful than any whisper. As he turned, he saw Jamarcus standing at the end of the hall, holding a simple white candle. The flame wavered, but held, casting a small, defiant circle of light. "I am here," his father said. Francis walked toward the light. With every step, the silver path outside faded. The phantom woods dissolved back into the neat rows of houses. The chill in his bones remained, but it was his now, a part of his history, not a command from his future. He had chosen again, and he knew, looking at his father's face in the candlelight, that he would keep choosing, as long as he had a home to come back to. The candle flames stretched and shrank, painting their shadows large and small against the walls of the hallway. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing in the quiet. The ordinary night slowly seeped back into the house, reclaiming it from the strange and the silver. Finally, Jamarcus cleared his throat. "I think there's some of that stew left," he said, his voice a little unsteady. "Might taste better warmed up." Francis nodded, the simple, domestic suggestion feeling like an anchor chain pulling him fully back into his own skin. They moved into the kitchen, and Jamarcus lit the gas stove with a match, the blue flame popping to life with a sound of pure, undeniable reality. Francis got out 2 bowls. They ate the second helping of stew at the kitchen counter, the steam warming their faces. It did taste better. The silence now was comfortable, filled with the shared understanding of a battle fought and won for tonight. When they were done, Jamarcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a heavy, warm weight. "I'm going to bed," he said. "You should too." Francis went back to his room. The lamp was working again, the bulb shining brightly on the blue notebook, still open to the unfinished sentence about the beef stew. He picked up the pen. It worked perfectly, the ink flowing smooth and black. He finished the sentence, then described the taste of the second helping, the way the carrots were softer, the broth richer. He wrote about the candle in the hall and the profound, simple courage in his father's eyes. He wrote until his eyelids grew heavy, and then he slept a dreamless sleep. The next morning, the sun was bright, and the world outside his window was perfectly, boringly normal. The equinox had passed. He had held the line. He knew the pulls would come again, the whispers would return. But he had his map, and he had his father, and he had a story that was still being written, one ordinary word at a time. It was enough. For now, and for all the mornings to come, it was enough. The next week, he bought a new lock for the front door, a heavy, solid deadbolt made of brass. Jamarcus helped him install it, their hands working together to drill the pilot holes and screw the plate into the frame. The sound of the bolt sliding home was a deep, satisfying thunk that seemed to push the air in the hallway outward, solidifying the walls. It was a small thing, a practical measure, but it felt like a ceremony. They were not just locking the world out. They were locking their own world in. At work, the routine felt different. Sorting mail was no longer a monotonous task, but an act of connection. He knew the names on the envelopes now, not just as addresses, but as parts of his map. Mrs. Gable received gardening catalogs and letters from a sister in Florida. Mr. Henderson got medical bills and newsletters from a veterans association. Francis handled each piece with a new reverence, acknowledging the tiny human stories they carried. He started taking a different route home, one that passed by the elementary school just as the children were being released. The chaotic, joyful noise of it was a balm. He saw a little girl with brown pigtails, just like his mother had in the photograph, break free from her friends and run into the arms of a waiting woman. The sight was a small, sharp pain, but it was a clean one. It was the pain of a real memory, not the seductive ache of a phantom. He mentioned the incident to Faye a few days later, standing among the shelves of her shop. She listened, her head tilted, and then she smiled, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. "You're learning," she said. "You're not just resisting them. You're replacing them. A ghost can't live in a house that's already full." He knew she was right. The chill was still there, a permanent winter in his bones, but it was becoming familiar, almost a part of him. It was no longer an invader. It was a reminder. It was the scar tissue from a wound that had almost been fatal, and its constant presence was proof that he had survived. One Saturday, he and Jamarcus cleaned out the garage. It was a job they had been putting off for years. They hauled out bags of old junk, sorted through boxes of forgotten things, and swept away the accumulated grime. In the very back, behind a stack of warped plywood, Francis found his mother's old bicycle, a rusty 10-speed with a bent wheel. He stood looking at it for a long time, the memory of her teaching him to ride on this very street surfacing with a clarity that was painful and beautiful. "Think we can fix it?" Jamarcus asked, coming to stand beside him. Francis ran a hand over the cracked leather seat. "Maybe," he said, "we can try." It wasn't about the bicycle. It was about the trying. It was about taking something broken from the past and deciding it was worth the effort to make it part of the present. As they carried the bike out into the sunlight, Francis felt the whisper stir, a faint, silvery thread of longing at the edge of his mind. He acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges an old injury when the weather changes. Then he turned his face to the sun and helped his father lift the bike into the trunk of the car, ready to begin the work of repair. The bike shop was a small, cluttered place that smelled of grease and rubber. The mechanic, a woman with grease-smudged glasses and a patient demeanor, looked the old 10-speed over. She pointed out the rust in the cables, the pitted chain, the cost of a new wheel. It was a long list. Jamarcus whistled softly, but Francis just nodded. The practicality of the project, the sheer number of small, solvable problems, was grounding. They decided to do it themselves. They bought a repair manual and and spent the next few weekends in the garage, their hands dirty, the radio playing old soul music. Jamarcus, who had always been more comfortable with a book than a wrench, fumbled with the derailleur, his brow furrowed in concentration. Francis, whose hands had only ever really held a pen, learned the satisfying click of a properly adjusted brake cable. They did not talk about the important things. They talked about the bike. They argued about the correct order for reassembling the freewheel. They celebrated when the new chain slid smoothly onto the sprockets. The project became its own kind of language, a way of rebuilding something more than just a machine. The day they finally got it working, Francis took it for a test ride. The gears were a little noisy, and the seat was uncomfortably hard, but it worked. He rode down his street, the wind in his hair, the familiar houses passing in a blur. For a few moments, he was just a man on a bike, not a keeper of a dangerous secret or a veteran of a silent war. The feeling was so simple, so pure, that it brought a lump to his throat. When he rode back into the driveway, Jamarcus was waiting, a look of quiet pride on his face. She'd be glad, he said, and that was all. It was enough. That night, Francis wrote about the bike in the blue notebook. He described the stubborn bolt they had to soak in penetrating oil for 2 days, the way the new tire smelled, the feeling of the cool autumn air rushing past as he pedaled. He was not just recording an event. He was weaving another strong, colorful thread into the tapestry of his life, making it thicker, harder for the cold to penetrate. He knew the other world was still there, waiting. He could feel its patient, predatory silence just beyond the edge of his perception. But his own world was louder now, filled with the sounds of his father humming, of frying food, of a bicycle chain turning. It was a life built not on grand magic, but on 1,000 small, stubborn acts of love and repair. And for now, that was the strongest spell he knew. The first frost came, etching delicate patterns on the window panes. Francis woke to a world made sharp and bright, the grass stiff and white in the morning sun. The cold inside him seemed to resonate with the cold outside, a faint, harmonic hum that was more feeling than sound. He dressed and went downstairs, where his father was already nursing a cup of coffee, staring out at the frozen lawn. "Winter-s here," Jamarcus said, his breath a small cloud in the kitchen air. Francis nodded, pouring his own coffee. The warmth of the mug was a temporary comfort against his perpetually cool skin. "It is." He went to work, the crunch of his boots on the frozen pavement, a satisfying, real sound. The post office was warm and stuffy, a refuge from the biting air. He sorted the mail with his usual care, but his mind was on the changing season. Winter felt like their territory. The bleakness, the long nights, the silence, it all seemed to play into the hands of the things that whispered. That evening, he found his father in the living room, building a fire in the fireplace. It was something they rarely did, the fireplace being inefficient and messy. But tonight, the act felt necessary. Jamarcus crumpled newspaper, arranged kindling, and lit a match. The flames caught, licking hungrily at the dry wood. They sat in the 2 worn armchairs, watching the fire dance. "Your mother loved a fire," Jamarcus said, his eyes fixed on the flames. Said it was like having a living thing in the house. A friendly one. Francis watched the light play over his father's face, smoothing out the lines of worry for a moment. He thought of the bonfire in the Phantom Woods, a cold, silver flame meant to consume. This fire was different. It was warm. It was for light and comfort, not for summoning. "Tell me about that," Francis said. "Tell me something about her I don't know." Jamarcus was quiet for so long that Francis thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft. He told Francis about the time she tried to bake a birthday cake from scratch and used salt instead of sugar. He described the way she could never keep a straight face during a serious movie, how her snorting laughter would inevitably ruin the tense moments. He spoke of her terrible singing voice and how she'd sing along to the radio anyway, loudly and off-key. With each story, Francis felt the house grow warmer, not from the fire, but from the inside. He was not just hearing anecdotes, he was reclaiming pieces of her, pulling them back from the vague, idealized memory the whispers used as bait. They were making her real again, flaws and all. And a real person was much harder to steal than a ghost. Later in his room, he wrote it all down. The failed cake, the ruined movies, the awful singing. He filled pages with the messy, beautiful, ordinary truth of her. When he finished, the blue notebook felt heavier, denser. The chill in his bones was still there, but it was surrounded now, outnumbered by a growing warmth that was his and his alone. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, but the one they had built together in memory still glowed, a small, defiant light against the coming dark. The following Saturday, Francis woke with a purpose that felt both new and ancient. The stories from the night before were a fresh current in his blood. He went to the garage, not for the bike, but for the remaining boxes they had pushed aside during their cleanup. He was looking for more evidence of a life lived. He found it in a water-stained cardboard box labeled Misk. Inside were not grand treasures, but the mundane artifacts of a shared existence. A stack of birthday cards with her loopy, enthusiastic handwriting. A recipe for lasagna, splattered with old sauce, that his father had obviously tried to follow many times. A single, cheap, silver earring in the shape of a feather. He held it in his palm, the metal warming to his touch. It was nothing, a forgotten bauble. And yet, it was everything. He brought the box inside and left it on the kitchen table. He didn't say anything to Jamarcus, who was reading the paper. He just let it sit there, an open invitation. Later that afternoon, he saw his father standing over the box, a single birthday card in his hand. He didn't look sad, exactly. He looked thoughtful, his fingers tracing the shape of the words she had written long ago. The whisper came then, not as a word, but as a sudden, vivid image in Francis's mind. He saw the bonfire, not as a distant flicker, but as a towering inferno of silver light. He felt the promise of it, a warmth that would not just surround him, but would fill him, burning out the human cold forever. The pull was so strong his knees felt weak. It was an answer to the ache, a final solution to the chill. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. He focused on the weight of the silver earring in his pocket. He focused on the sound of his father turning a page of the newspaper. He focused on the lingering smell of coffee and the faint, greasy smell of the bike chain from the garage. He built his wall, brick by mundane brick. The image of the bonfire did not vanish, but it receded, becoming a picture in a book he had chosen to close. The cost of that warmth was his own story, and he was no longer willing to pay it. He had too many pages left to write. That night, he took the blue notebook and the silver earring to his room. He placed the earring on the desk and opened the notebook. He did not write about the whisper or the bonfire. He wrote about the recipe for lasagna. He described the faded ink, the specific brand of tomato paste she had always insisted on, the way his father always added too much oregano, just like she had. He was anchoring it all, tying the memories down with the sturdy rope of words. The whisper was a siren's call, but his story was an anchor, and it was holding fast